go into a public building and are overwhelming the security resources, it takes an effort to get them out. You can't use your traditional means, chemical ammunition systems that you would use in an outside crowd and try and move people there. You don't want to, compromise the environment of the Capitol where people are sheltering in place and trying to carry out operations while sections are being held down. So this has happened before, not at this location and not to this extent, but these challenges have happened before. The good thing about D.C. is they have a very strict firearm policy. I haven't seen in this crowd, like I've seen in other crowds, where state buildings have taken over a number of firearms amongst those who are participating in the protests, which lowers the tension between officers and the protesters and lessens the likelihood of somebody getting hurt in lethal violence. So we need the president's message was, he delivered that he wanted people to leave the area. I hope if I was the Capitol Police, I would be putting that on my cell phones, and the officers be showing that to the crowd, tapping people on the shoulder and saying, it's over, it's time to go home. And if you don't want to go home, we're going to take action against you.
Meanwhile, D.C. Mayor, of course, that being Muriel Bowser, is speaking, saying that actions at the Capitol are shameful and unlawful. You speak about the firearms policy in D.C. You speak about, of course, the 6 p.m. curfew that is going to be enacted. Dan, the long-term ramifications of visiting the Capitol now, they were talking of this bygone day where you could walk in and out of this sanctum hall, unlikely going forward for the time being.
I think this is something that has to be dealt with, and the Capitol has to be brought back under control. Ordinarily, the security measures at the Capitol are, above the need and requirement to keep our congressmen and senators safe. We want to get the resources in there back to restore that security program. Yeah. And if there's adjustments that need to be made, we need to make those adjustments. But the best thing about our Capitol is that we can go up and visit it and listen to our congressional operatives do what they need to do and have the business of the country done. That's what we value most. And we also value peaceful protest. What we don't value is when protest turns violent and tries to shut down the constitutionally obligated duties of our elected officials in carrying out what they are responsible to do, because we, the citizens of America, have voted for them to do it.
Daniel Linsky, well said. We thank you so much coming to us from Kroll. And on that note, congressional leaders are being evacuated from Capitol Complex, we understand, according to CNN. But wow, Joe, Romain, what a day, and one that is painful to watch, I'm sure, Romain.
Very painful to watch, and you mentioned the Capitol. We just want to also thank Eric Wasson, Laura Davison, Craig Gordon, a lot of folks down there in D.C., of course, who were in harm's way and, of course, stuck through it to bring us coverage of what was going on. A pretty momentous day here, Joe.
We expected theatrics today, I think would be the consensus. Nothing like, however, the images that we've seen today.
Remember to stay tuned for our special coverage at the end of this. Special coverage with David Weston. Stay tuned. This is Bloomberg.
Chinese brands now account for 7 of the country's top 10 cosmetics lines, up from just 3 in 2017. That has pushed out foreign brands like L'Oreal's Maybelline, which has seen its share of China's makeup market plunge by half since 2010. For more, we're joined by Bloomberg editor Bruce Einhorn. Bruce, why the drop?
Chinese brands are becoming much more adept at reaching Chinese consumers, especially now at a time when more consumers are reluctant to go shopping outside. People are spending more time at home. People are spending more time on social media. Chinese brands are very good at using social media, using live streaming, using other things in order to market. Chinese brands also tend to be less expensive, and so at a time when the economy is struggling a bit, there's a lot of uncertainty, people are more budget conscious, Chinese brands have a bit more of an advantage.
Our generation's biggest problem.
Climate change is happening.
And the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered.
I certainly would expect that we'll have Goldman Sachs employees back in full by the end of the year. We will get through this, and I'm really hopeful that over the course of the next 6 months, we see a real improvement, but there's still work to be done.
We explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
From New York to our Bloomberg television watchers all around the world, I'm David Weston, and this is a special edition of Balance of Power covering the unrest in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. today, as pro-Trump demonstrators, really rioters, took to the streets and ultimately charged Capitol Hill and the Capitol building itself, invading the Senate chamber while they were trying to tally up the Electoral College votes. For a review of what happened today in this very extraordinary, tumultuous, and deeply disturbing day, we welcome now our colleague, Laura Davison. So, Laura, from your perspective in Washington, what happened?
It was really an incredible and historic, not in a good way, kind of day. The proceedings this afternoon at 1 o'clock kicked off as expected. The House and Senate were in the House chamber. There was an objection to the Arizona results, and the two chambers broke up, and they went to start debating. And just as the debate kicked off, Mitch McConnell gave this really fiery speech on the Senate floor saying, we need to move past this. The election has been decided. Joe Biden has won. It is not our place to overturn the will of the people. Really, as he was saying those words, protesters started storming the Capitol. They were able at several points to get into the building and really just overwhelmed the U.S. Capitol Police Force. There were several who were inside the chamber on the Senate floor, yelling that Trump had won the election. There was a standoff, an armed standoff over on the House side, and there are still protesters, in the building roaming around. The U.S. Capitol Police Force, which has been reinforced by National Guard troops, state troopers, Secret Service, are still working to secure the building, and really the whole process today has been put on hold and raises just a ton of questions, not only of what happens procedurally going forward in the next couple days and weeks, but really just sort of how we think about our U.S. Capitol building as a building, as well as how the two parties and Republicans in particular think about what our democracy is.
So let's talk about that Capitol building, which is such an important building for all of us in the United States of America. Do we have any sense? We saw video of damage being done, windows broken, people breaking in. There was at least one report of a possible casualty. You referred to an armed standoff on the House side. We saw some still photos of that. Do we have any idea of injuries?
Pardon, what the composure is?
Casualties, people who were injured during the demonstration.
There have been reports of one casualty. There were lots of sort of broken, windows and doors and those sorts of things, tear gas. But so far, only one report of casualties. We are heading into the nighttime hours here. There's a curfew imposed by the city of D.C. Starting in about an hour. But security forces are very concerned that violence could escalate, either on the streets or, if they're unable to secure the building. As nightfall comes, that's a big concern. One sort of factor, on the other hand, is that a lot of the people who came in for these demonstrations are on buses that are scheduled to leave this evening. That is giving D.C. and Capitol Police Forces some hope that things are sort of on the downward side versus ramping up for more violence.
Okay, Laura, thank you so much for that report. That's Laura Davison, our colleague in Washington. Now we're going to turn to a man who has a very difficult job today, maybe every day, but particularly today. He's the man charged with keeping law and order in Washington, D.C. He's Carl Racine. He's the Attorney General of Washington, D.C. So, Mr. Attorney General, thank you so much for being with us. Give us your sense of how things are on the streets of Washington right now.
Well, I think it's, as Laura reported quite well, what you saw today was action taken not by protesters, but by folks who were intent on violating law. David, as you know, in DC, we're used to having protesters. They bring signs, they chant, from time to time to get close to the police line, and from time to time have to be pushed back. But never has a protester in the District of Columbia, led by a group of people encouraged by the President of the United States, actually gone through the police line and into one of our most cherished democratic institutions, the United States Capitol. Think about this. Senators and congresspeople were huddled down onto the ground, ushered into tunnels with gas masks on in order to evade violence. This is America. And now is the time for us to calmly, resolutely tell the President of the United States to demand his supporters to leave peacefully now.
Now, the President of the United States actually issued a video a short time ago, as you know, saying, please go home. Although he did say it was a fraudulent election, that it was a landslide and people were stealing from it. It never happened before. But he said, now it's time to go home, saying, by the way, at the end of it, I love you, to the people that, as you say, really are rioters. Talking about those people who are much more than protesters, you're entirely right about that. Do we know, are they still in the Capitol, some of them?
Well, I'm limited by my television set and my team that is embedded in the command center of the Metropolitan Police Department. And what I know from the television set and my team reports that are literally coming out every 5 minutes is that the process of getting those folks out of the Capitol is underway, but they still are on the Capitol grounds. And as to President Trump's comments, think about that. What he's indicated again is that the cause, according to him, is a stolen election. Well, the United States Supreme Court, countless other courts have found that there was no theft of the election. Even many Republicans are telling you that there was no theft of the election. The president has criticized the United States Supreme Court. That's a conservative court. He's criticized now his vice president, when we know the common denominator is the President of the United States, who's acting recklessly and selfishly after his own interest and putting people in our institutions in harm's way. This is a sad day, as Laura commented, for the United States of America.
No question about that. You cannot be a citizen of this country and not be sad looking at those images. Give us a sense, though, was it entirely a surprise? I mean, it's a shock to see people breaking into the Capitol building in that way. At the same time, as you suggest, President Trump had called for demonstrations. He gave a speech about noontime, East Coast time, basically saying this was an illegitimate election. The next president will be illegitimate. Was it entirely surprising that this might turn violent? Were we prepared enough, or as we should have been, in the Washington's Capitol?
I think those are really fair questions that you're asking, David. Was it a surprise that the protest turned violent? I don't think we can claim surprise because the groups that came to protest, and I'm not saying every single protester, but there were groups that came to protest who were hell-bent on violence. There are groups that came to protest who are hate groups. They don't like people of color. They don't particularly care for folks who are immigrants, notwithstanding their contribution to the country, and they came indeed to do damage, and they did. I think there's another question to be asked, and that is, we have seen these groups. We've seen them take over the Michigan Capitol, but the United States Capitol, where we have Capitol Police and other federal authorities responsible for protecting a symbol of our democracy, I would urge you to consider that that should never be incurred upon by any protesters. protect our democracy and rule of law. That's what makes us unique.
Give us a sense, if you can, Mr. Attorney General, of what is going on now and bringing forces together to make sure that this is brought under control and that the rioters are evicted. I understand that there's been a reaching out, not only National Guard, but also Northern Virginia police, Maryland police, maybe even as far away as Delaware. Can you give us a sense of what forces are being brought to bear on Capitol Hill and in the District of Columbia generally right now?
So everything that you just recited is the same that I've heard. I can't independently confirm that. I have every good reason to believe that your reporting is correct, and that is that the neighbors of the District of Columbia, we really have a pretty close-knit neighborhood. Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware. These are jurisdictions that really interact and intersect together, and they're coming to lend a hand because they could see the potential for chaos. And let me just say, some of the groups that are represented today, they create havoc during the day. They create mass violence at night. And so I'm hopeful and prayerful that that doesn't occur, but it's really at night's fall when these groups really go at it and look to hurt people, property, and symbols of our democracy.
So I'm glad you raised that, because as I calculate the time right now, we're about 50 minutes away, 50 minutes away from the curfew that Mayor Bowser's called. Do we have any indication whether that curfew will hold? As I understand it, basically, if you're non-essential, you're not supposed to be in the street doing anything as of 6 p.m. Eastern Time.
Well, that's right. And let me just reiterate that. If you're not an essential worker, and in this case, I'm talking about law enforcement, security detail, and the like, you need to be home by 6 p.m. and not be on the streets of the District of Columbia. Now, whether groups that have clearly violated the law throughout the day will all of a sudden start complying with the law is something that I frankly doubt. But I do believe that the Metropolitan Police Department and other law enforcement officers will seek to enforce the curfew in order to keep the peace. And my office will certainly prosecute folks who violate the curfew.
Mr. Attorney General, I can't thank you enough for your time on a very difficult day, a very disappointing day for all of us. That is Carl Rossini. He is the Attorney General of Washington, D.C. Of course, all of these things have effects as well in the markets, and we turn now to Taylor Riggs. And Taylor, I must say, even as we've been talking here, we have various CEOs of J.P. Morgan, of IBM coming out and condemning the violence in Washington, D.C. Have the markets reacted at all to what's going on in Washington?
You know what's interesting, David, is the markets woke up. They were indeed focused on Washington, but it was all about Georgia this morning. As it was clear that Georgia was turning blue, was the reflation, inflationary trade, record highs on all the major indices. Then, of course, around 2 or 3 p.m. when it went from a peaceful protest to going into this Capitol and storming the Capitol, you did get a little bit of a dip down in futures, but overall you're at a record high on the Dow. The S&P just 8 points away from that. Tech, of course, bearing the brunt of a sell-off today. They don't like higher rates. If we can show rates, we'll do that in a moment. You flip up the board. David, this really was the story of the day. I always look for confirmation of some of the panic that we see within the equity markets, in the bond markets. And that is what didn't move today that was surprising. You have rates higher by 11 basis points on the 10 and the 30-year yield. That is that reflationary blue wave scenario that the rate markets were reacting to in the news from this morning. Finally, let's just flip up the board because we like to go cross asset at Bloomberg again, looking for further confirmation. We know that the theme of the year has been further dollar weakness. When you get periods of panic, David, like we saw in March, you see big spikes up in dollar strength. We did not see that today. You got further dollar weakness, and you didn't see sort of the classic safe haven trade that you would typically see in big moments of panic, like yen strength, like Swissy strength relative to the euro or the dollar. So the yield and the currency markets, David, showing some calm that we would know going full circle back to the equity markets off some of the record highs that we had seen earlier in the session.
Taylor, thank you so much for that report on the markets. That's Taylor Riggs reporting on the markets on this tumultuous day. Coming up next, with the Capitol lockdown, what happens to that tallying of the Electoral College vote? That's coming up next. This is Bloomberg. This is a special edition of Balance of Power. I'm David Weston. So the reason why the Senate and the House were in session were to count up the Electoral College votes. And now the question is, how do we get back to that? We need to have somebody appointed president by January 20, according to the Constitution of the United States. For maybe some answers, if we know some answers, we turn now to our Washington bureau chief, and he is, of course, Craig Gordon. So, Craig, what do we know about how they're going to go back to that process of some objections and some arguments and some votes?
Yeah, we've already started to see some statements from some of the senators, not too many of the ones that are involved directly in this challenge, but saying, we need to get back to the Capitol, we need to get back to work. Lindsey Graham, obviously people know, a Republican senator from South Carolina, close friend of Donald Trump, is kind of saying, supporting Joe Biden, saying, we need to make this official and move forward. Joe Manchin, a conservative Democrat from West Virginia, saying, we shouldn't let the thugs, that's his word, stop us from doing, the people's work, and let's get this going tonight. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce just has a statement out saying the same thing. So, there's definitely, I'm reluctant to make the comparison, but it kind of reminded me of when the, Congress gathered on the steps of the Capitol and saying, God bless America, where you have a kind of maybe a bit of a moment of national unity, ironic, of course, because the whole day was kind of based on a moment of disunity where you had several Republicans trying to challenge the election of Joe Biden to be the president. So who knows? Maybe there'll be some moment where people say, this has gone too far. We need to get back to work. We need to certify Joe Biden as president in time for the January 20th inauguration and move the country forward.
So Craig, you're a reporter par excellence, so I'm not going to ask you to speculate, but maybe a little bit. In this sense, you're a real student of Washington, been there for some time. It's hard for you to imagine Ted Cruz, the senator from Texas, giving that same speech after what's happened that he did before. I mean, what's going to happen to the objections? Are they going to go back in whenever they get around to it and have all those objections and all those debates about whether there's a legitimate election or not a legitimate election?
Yeah, it's a fair question, and again, I don't mind speculating in the sense because I'm speculating only in the sense of it's like human nature. Like obviously Ted Cruz, you might agree with his politics, you might disagree with his politics, but I think he loves his country. I think he believes in the Constitution, and I think it might be a little hard to kind of have that same fire and brimstone he had this morning in kind of challenging the results of an election that I think we can all pretty much agree by now has been decided. Joe Biden won by 6 million votes and 100 some odd, electoral college votes. On the other hand, Ted Cruz, part of his speech was like, look, we are afforded this opportunity to raise questions about the integrity of the election by the Constitution. There's a process to challenge the electors, to question the electors, to look at the process. He, of course, is calling for an emergency 10-day, panel to study whether there were any irregularities in the vote. Again, that seems like a little bit more of a kind of a fig leaf than maybe a totally serious proposal in terms of something that's going to actually change the result of the election. But, you might see a Ted Cruz say, this country is built on, honest disagreements and the First Amendment right to express them. What we saw earlier in this chamber was not that. That's protest. That's violence. That's different. But, I am going to exercise my right. But I agree, to use the phrase, it's kind of a bad look for the Republicans right now to kind of take this back. They were talking about doing 3 states, 2 to 3 to 4 hours of debate for each state. We had all been planning to be here up until about 2 in the morning. If they were to restart this tonight somehow, you could be talking about literally watching the sunrise, and I'm not sure anyone has the stomach for that right now.
Yeah, it certainly sounds right. Craig, it's always a delight to have you with us. That's Craig Gordon. He's our Washington bureau chief. So Craig just said that it's a bad look right now for the Republicans. Let's go to somebody who knows the Republicans terribly well, Rick Davis. He's our political contributor who ran John McCain's campaign, as well as so many others. He's a partner in Stone Court Capital. So how do you put the Republican Party back together again? Because we focus on the Republicans because, in fairness, we saw that even in the debate in the Senate that we saw, it was Republican against Republican with Mitch McConnell against Ted Cruz.
That's exactly right, David. I think that one thing that needs a clear distinction is that this is a Donald Trump-inspired protest, a Donald Trump-inspired, both inside and outside the Capitol. So Ted Cruz is not speaking for the Republican Party when he protests the electors. He's speaking for Donald Trump. The protesters on the grounds of the Capitol and in the Capitol aren't violating our institution there because they are good standing Republicans who support everybody on the ticket. It's because they're Trump supporters. And in essence, Trump encouraged them to go and do exactly what they're doing earlier this morning when he met with this crowd of rioters in front of the White House. So if you read Mitch McConnell's remarks today, where he first introduced the Senate deliberation on the discussion around the Arizona electors, he was very clear. It basically was a talk to the Republican caucus, and he was very clear that he didn't support this initiative, that he thought it was walking down a very dangerous path, not just for the party, but for our democracy. And you always used to use a certain line, which was what's good for our country should be good for our party, and we should never do anything in our party that isn't good for the country. This is a big departure from that. And so out of this will come a very serious debate. As you remarked before with Craig, Joe Biden will be sworn in as president, and the Republican Party will have a post-Trump look at itself in the mirror, and there will be a very, very difficult debate as to how you manage forward and who becomes the leader of the party. With the Senate going Democratic, which appears to be a certainty now, Mitch McConnell would have been, as majority leader, our top elected Republican in the country. Now we don't have that. And so a vacuum has been created not just by Donald Trump leaving office, but Mitch McConnell becoming a minority leader in the next Congress. And so there'll be a rush of activity. It's probably one of the reasons Ted Cruz is doing what he's doing. Power grabs come in many shapes and forms. And so I think that we are in a very, very difficult period as the old grand old party is going to look at itself after today and say, did we aid and abet an attack on the Capitol by the rhetoric of people who are office holders in the Republican Party?
I also wonder, Rick, as some news is crossing just right now with Facebook coming up with a statement saying the violent protests in the Capitol today are a disgrace. We prohibit incitement and calls for violence on our platform. They're going to remove such content. What does this do to tech, to social media, and the role that it may have played in this as a practical matter? It already was not having an easy time with either Republicans or Democrats. Is there going to be renewed focus now on the role of social media in political discourse?
No question, David. This has been an active and robust conversation for many years now. It was at the core of President Trump's efforts to try and get rid of Section 230 in the Defense Authorization Act, that he was unsuccessful at doing at the last minute. But both Republicans and Democrats agree that social media has been a platform for hate speech for some time, and that without government regulation, the industry has not really done enough to improve the political discourse or the cultural and human discourse on their platforms. So I think you're going to see a bipartisan meeting of the minds around what is going to be the official government position on how to regulate speech on these social media platforms. Because extremism is not just found in the Middle East. You're looking at it on television tonight. The people who are attacking the Capitol and flying the Confederate flag inside the Capitol today are extremists, and those things do not help our country grow and prosper.
Very well said. Thank you so much to Rick Davis of Stonecrow Capital. He's our political contributor here at Bloomberg. In the meantime, almost lost in the rounding in all this was the second senatorial race was declared in Georgia. So now both seats went to the Democrats. And for a report on that, we turn to our intrepid reporter on the scene in Georgia, Emily Wilkins. Emily, so it's official.
It is official now. Democrats have won both Senate seats in Georgia. That means that Democrats will control the Senate for at least the next 2 years. It's going to be tight. It's a 50-50 split, but Democrats do have control as Vice President Kamala Harris can do any tiebreaker votes for the Democrats. This is a huge victory. It wasn't.
No, go ahead, Emily, because the thing I really want to talk about is there any possibility of a recount?
There is a bit of a possibility for a recount. We are still watching votes come in. The key statistic to look for at this point is 0.4 5%. If the candidates have that margin or a smaller margin between them, either of them can ask for a recount and Georgia will do it. However, at this point, neither race is within that margin. Both the Democrats have a larger margin on their Republican opponents than that. Of course, we still have more votes coming in at this point, and Senator David Perdue has promised to take any sort of legal action to make sure that all votes are counted. So we might see this play out over the next several weeks.
Well, so we're talking about legal action again, Emily. I had not heard that before. So we might do this all again and have some lawsuits brought?
We might. This is something that Perdue's team hasn't given a lot of details on at this point. It was a statement that he put out a little bit earlier this morning. So we're going to be watching those campaigns to see what they decide to do. Obviously, the news in the Capitol has overshadowed things a bit today. Kelly Loeffler was up there initially to cast a vote. She is still there. So we're going to be watching this story play out. But at this point, we've heard Georgia election officials say that this race, it didn't have any fraud. It went very smoothly, and they believe that everything we've seen at this point is legitimate.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's been terrific reporting you've done down there, Emily, for a long time now. We really appreciate all your reporting from the state of Georgia, from Emily Wilkins. And as I say, now it's official. It'll be 50-50 split in the Senate between Republicans and Democrats with, of course, the Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. She will be casting the deciding vote, but it'll be a very close balance, without any doubt. Coming up, we're going to be talking with Representative Joyce Beatty, Democrat of Ohio, who was actually in the Capitol during the disturbance. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television.
We have some good news in terms of vaccines and a chance to overcome the health crisis, but we are not there yet.
We need the fiscal stimulus, and we need it relatively quickly, because I can see where the second wave's coming. You can see consumer spending beginning to get impacted again.
What we need is surveillance to be stronger. We need public health measures, because you have no other way at the beginning. This is your best weapon, and you need to use it well.
The good news is that both the vaccines and the therapeutics, in particular the antibodies, are coming along and will start to bring that number way down.
We don't just need more investment in public health. We must also rethink how we value health.
I do believe a targeted fiscal stimulus is going to be in order to really begin a more equalized economy.
I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election
that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side. But you have to go home now. We have to have peace.
That was President Donald J. Trump addressing the riots that have taken place on Capitol Hill today in a recorded statement that came out just a little over an hour ago now. We turn now to our White House correspondent. He is Mario Parker. For the White House reaction, give us a sense within the White House, Mario, as far as you know it, about what their reaction is to this. Do they know what their reaction is?
Well, it's the White House's reaction to it so far has been less than sure-footed. The president, as you played the clip, released a message sometime well after the Capitol had been breached. And the message, again, appeared to be underwhelming or insufficient to really address the magnitude of what's happening. He still repeated some of his unsubstantiated claims that the election was stolen from him. And so those type of statements do little to calm down a crowd that is so worked up right now that it's essentially stormed the U.S. Capitol.
Yeah, the president said, I know how you feel, now go home in peace. But at the same time, we now have a statement, according to the Associated Press, from the Washington, D.C. police chief, saying at least 5 weapons have been recovered and at least 13 people have been arrested so far in the rioting that has gone on. This certainly is inconsistent with what President Trump said he was trying to accomplish.
Right, absolutely. And it's inconsistent with some of the president's rhetoric this past summer and throughout his campaign on backing police, saying, essentially denouncing violence, in the wake of some of the racial unrest this past summer. And you're seeing in the Twitter sphere, some of the president's most ardent supporters kind of urge him and both his supporters that are on the ground here in the Capitol to just calm down. The former White House communications director, Alyssa Farah, just came out with a tweet where she says that the election was not stolen, that they lost fair and square, that there were some instances of fraud, but nothing of the magnitude that the president has claimed. And so you're seeing some of the president's allies try to at least calm down this situation.
Okay, Mario, thank you so much for being with us tonight. That is Mario Parker. He is Bloomberg White House reporter. I want to turn to somebody now who has served in the White House, this White House of George Herbert Walker Bush, as an aide to the president. He is the Reverend Joe Watkins from Philadelphia. So, Reverend Joe, thank you so much for being with us. I mean,
Thanks,
you
David.
served under a Republican president, but a Republican president that I dare say would be appalled is too weak a word for, I think, what President Bush 41's reaction would be tonight.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Bush 41, Bush 43. This is a very, very difficult night for all of us as Americans to watch. I mean, this is the greatest country in the world, the home of the free, the land of the brave, a country where power passes peacefully from one administration to the next, where when presidents lose elections, they welcome their successor as President George H.W. Bush did, and they wish that person the best for the sake of the country, because it's not about us, it's about the country. And this is really difficult to see. I thought that Mitch McConnell gave the best speech that he's given, certainly in recent years, when he spoke today on the floor of the Capitol before all of his colleagues, when he said, this is bigger than us, it's about the country, about the democracy. And that's what it's about today. This is really very, very difficult for all of us to watch.
You make a really important point, I think, Joe, which is we've tended in this country in recent years to think of it as Republican or Democrat, left or right. This issue really cuts across that. I thought that the Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, was actually lecturing his own caucus to a large degree, people in his own caucus, and really remonstrating with them, saying, you're doing the wrong thing here. So it's not simply a Republican issue. It's a broader issue in our society.
Absolutely. Mitch McConnell was just trying to call the members of his own caucus to the better angels of their nature, to do the right thing, to not think about what's politically expedient, how you can grab hold of the incumbent president's base and make that base your own, but think about the country, what it takes to move the country forward. And I liked what he said. I thought it was so appropriate, so timely. I just wish that everybody had heard it and that everybody had responded accordingly to what he said.
So what is the way forward for the Republican Party in your judgment?
Well, we've got to regroup, certainly, and the Republican Party has to figure out if we're still the party of Abraham Lincoln, if we care about the importance of fiscal responsibility, and that we also care about the direction of the country, about Americans who are hurting the most, as well as Americans who are in business and who may be prospering. We've got to be a party that is the party of all Americans, and that is more diverse than it has been in the past, and certainly more willing to lead when it comes to matters that ordinary Americans care about. And I just hope that this can be the party of Abraham Lincoln, who united the country in a very, very difficult time. Hopefully, this can be a party going forward that unites this country in a time when we're so fractured. And it's going to take really, again, the strongest voices and the people with the best hearts in our party to step forward now and to be heard, so that others can follow their lead.
The best hearts. I also wonder, Joe, if it's going to require some courage on someone's part, because it certainly appears to the outside world right now that some people within the Republican Party have been concerned about alienating the core Trump base, who does not seem to be too inclined to change their mind on things.
Very, very well said, David. I think that this is a time for courage, and it's not for political expediency, not for self-interest, but for public interest, especially the American public interest. And that calls for saying what needs to be said now at this difficult time, and speaking truth to those people who have chosen, for whatever reason, to storm the steps of the Capitol. And not just to tell them to go home, but to tell them that they have to respect the rule of law, and that they have to respect the outcome of these American elections, and that they have to respect the will of the American people, just as they want their will to be respected. When Americans vote and they decide on a leader, our responsibility as Americans is to accept that, and then to be rooting for the new leader of the country to succeed. We may not agree on every issue. We may disagree, and that's why we have a Congress where people can air their disagreements. But at the same time, we ought never descend into mobs of people armed storming the Capitol of the United States. And I wrote this little book, David, this 30-page book called The New PC, Practical Consideration. And all I say in the book is that how we talk to each other, how we treat each other in politics and in daily life matters. We've got to treat each other like we care about each other, like we love each other. Even if we don't agree, we've got to listen to each other and love each other. And I'm hoping and praying that that's the direction that we take. I'm certainly going to be an advocate for what I've been talking about for the last few years.
So, Joe, I also wonder whether that message is important for both sides of the aisle as a practical matter. It's going to be very easy for some Democrats right now to point a finger and say this is a Republican issue. It's also going to be terribly important, I think, if Joe Biden means what he says, and I believe him, that he wants to be a president for all the people, to reach across and really be understanding and accommodating to Republicans and conservatives.
I think President-elect Biden is showing tremendous restraint, and that's just the right attitude at this time of division in the country. It's whoever is president, and it's Joe Biden who will be the next president of the United States, that person has to bring us together and be the president for all the people, whether they voted for him or didn't vote for him, and move us forward that way. And not be so concerned about their political future. And I think that Joe Biden is not concerned about that as much as he's concerned about moving the country forward. But he's got to move us forward, and he's got to bring us together. And I like everything that he said so far in that vein. He's not looking to retaliate. He's just looking to bring people together, to cull the best ideas from both sides and to move the country forward. And I hope that spirit kind of takes a central place with Democrats and Republicans. How do we move the country forward? What are the best ideas? How do we get that done and get it done? How do we have dialogue that's useful and helpful to the American people without being destructive to democracy?
We can all hope. I'm sad to say that it looks a little harder tonight than it did this morning, but maybe this can be turned into something good. Thank you so much to the Reverend Joe Watkins, former aide to George Herbert Walker Bush, our 41st president. In the meantime, there was something else that happened today. The second seat in the Senate went to a Democrat in the state of Georgia. Coming up next, we're going to talk with Democratic Congresswoman Joyce Beatty from the state of Ohio about the significance of that move. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Are you worried that people won't take the vaccine?
We remain concerned about vaccine hesitancy.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here?
It's a huge market, it's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
At this hour, our democracy is under unprecedented assault, unlike anything we've seen in modern times. An assault on the citadel of liberty.
That was President-elect Biden, Joe Biden, speaking just a short time ago, addressing, of course, the riots on Capitol Hill by some pro-Trump forces. We now are going to welcome somebody who was in the building during that assault. She is Democratic Congresswoman Joyce Beatty from the state of Ohio. First of all, I need to ask, how are you, Congresswoman?
Well, at this time, I'm doing a lot better. As you can imagine, a few hours ago, it was very unsettling. Although we knew or had heard that there would be protesters here, I don't think anyone imagined that they would be able to not only get inside, but to take over the Capitol steps, to scale the walls of the United States Capitol, get into Speaker Pelosi's office and take over both chambers. You know, we heard gunshots being fired. We saw glass being broken. So members were barricaded in offices, escorted off the floor, tear gas masks were provided. I'm so proud of the members of Congress. They acted immediately for the safety of themselves and the staff. I had brand new staff with me. Today was the first meeting of the Congressional Black Caucus for the 117th session. So, you know, we are still waiting for full clearance. But when you think about as many protests as many of us have witnessed and marched in and participated in, it was a different day today when I think about photos that I look back on when Black Lives Matter came to the Capitol and how it was lined up with officers, and they weren't allowed to come to the steps. And then today, we watch people scaling the walls and climbing up to the windows and coming with tools and things that could be harmful to the police officers. But it gives me pause to wonder, how did they get through metal doors? How did they get into the Capitol? How could they be in the Capitol, and we had footage of them moving through statuary halls, moving through cannons, and yet they weren't escorted, arrested? Where were all of the vans and the trucks to arrest them? It gives you great discomfort that they were able to do this at this level.
So, Congressman, you were all there in order to take the tallies of the Electoral College. And, of course, there were going to be some objections and some debates, but ultimately a vote. I think we all knew how it was going to come out. Do you have any sense of when you can get back to that? We need to have those Electoral College votes tallied, as I understand it, so that Joe Biden can become the president of the United States come January 20.
Oh, absolutely. I am very comfortable that we will go back into the chambers and do the people's work. This is another thing that this president has done. He's big on getting you to reflect to or to defect to something else, thinking that he can stop us. We will stay here all night if it takes us to get safety clearance to go back in and to resume voting. I think it only energizes us more to know why we have to do this and how much opportunity and hope we can have when we have President-elect Joe Biden sworn into office on January the 20th. So I am estimating probably in another hour or so, many will go back to the chambers. Others will stay safe where we are. And then within another couple of hours, I am comfortable that we will be able to go to our offices and to proceed as planned in alphabetical order to vote and to do the people's business. Now, it may take us into the wee hours of the night, but we will do this.
So just to be clear, you believe, Congresswoman, that Congress will complete its constitutional responsibilities before it leaves that building finally to actually finalize the Electoral College vote. So we will have a definite answer before you're done.
Oh, I am absolutely confident that we will go back and vote, because if we don't, that means Trump got what he wanted. And we are bigger than that, and that's why we will build back better. That's why we will do what we have to do the people's work. We're not going to let them make us afraid to do our work. Now, we understand that we had to be barricaded and protected for safety reasons, but I can tell you, no one that's in this room with me is looking like they are afraid to go back in and do the work. Many people are bothered. Many people are upset. Many people are angry that we had to experience this and that we didn't have more protection early on, that the National Guard was not approved earlier to be here to stop those individuals who were being destructive to the United States Capitol and putting members and staff at risk.
So, Congresswoman, it's always difficult, if not impossible, to figure out the ramifications of something as profound and disturbing as we saw today. But you mentioned this is a new Congress just starting out. It's going to be a different Congress than any other, given the way you've started out. And the fact that today we had 2 Senate seats come in for the Democrats, so there'll be a tie, 50-50, to be broken, presumably, by Vice President-elect Kamala Harris for the Democrats. Well, how do you think this may change the course of this Congress?
Oh, I think we will definitely see a change in the course of this Congress by the mere fact that we now have the majority in all 3, the House. Today, the tie in the Senate, certainly, as you know, now Vice President-elect Kamala Harris will be sitting in a very powerful seat as it relates to the Senate in breaking ties. She comes from the Senate. She'll be the vice president, and she is scholarly and ready. I think when we think about what happened today, tomorrow when we wake up, we will know that after January the 20th, it will be a new day for the people. It will be a new day where we can talk about real issues and we can get real legislation passed. We won't have to be wondering what we're going to do about voting rights and wondering what we're going to do about policing acts. We will be ready. So this afternoon will be a good day. It gives us our stamp of approval that a new day is coming, and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will lead us in that new day.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Congresswoman. Well, I wish you all the very best, and I hope that you're right, that you can get that job done before you're done. And I'm very happy that you're in good shape. Thank you so much for being with us. That's Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, Democrat from the state of Ohio. Coming up, we're going to talk about what comes next, insofar as we can see it. We're going to have Craig Gordon back, our Washington bureau chief. This is special coverage on Bloomberg Television. I'm David Weston.
you a sense of the real-time action. The 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
This is a special edition of Balance of Power. I'm David Weston. We are covering the disruption, the rioting at Capitol Hill today in Washington, D.C. And we're joined once again by our Bloomberg Washington bureau chief. He is Craig Gordon. Craig, what's happened, and I've just seen it, is a rather remarkable development, I think. As we know, President Trump, about 2 hours ago or so, taped a video plea to the rioters to say, please go home. I understand your pain. I understand it was a fraudulent election. It was a landslide for us, and it was stolen for us, but still go home and be peaceful. And now we have Facebook pulling down that video, and a vice president, yes, of integrity of Facebook saying this is an emergency situation and we are taking appropriate emergency measures, including removing President Trump's video. This is pretty extraordinary, and I must say it was the prelude to that was several prominent people, including Kara Swisher out in Silicon Valley, was saying this is on your head, Facebook and Twitter, if you don't take these things down. This is pretty amazing.
No, I agree. And obviously, we all know that Donald Trump's been kind of in a war with the social media companies. He's been trying to get rid of the Section 230 protections that they have, the liability protections that did not actually go through in the past Congress, unlikely to go through in the new Democratic Congress that Joe Biden will inherit on January 20th. So it's a continuation of that. I mean, the interesting thing to me was that several people, including Joe Biden himself, said, Donald Trump needs to go on national television and try to calm the waters. Of course, it's Donald Trump, so he can't just go and make a video where he tries to calm the waters. He then has to essentially praise or at least offer comfort to these protesters saying, yes, I know, I feel your pain, the election was stolen, it's a terrible thing. So even in, allegedly trying to calm things down, he managed to splash a little more gasoline onto the fire, and I think Facebook said enough.
In the meantime, the AP is reporting that, in fact, the officials have declared the Capitol secure. We just talked with Joyce Beatty, the Democratic congresswoman from Ohio, and she said, as far as she's concerned, they're going to keep going tonight, however long it takes. They're going to get back into those chambers, and they're going to go back, and they're going to review those Electoral College votes and get it done. Is that plausible?
Yeah, I mean, we've been starting to hear some of the same things. Our terrific House reporters, Billy House and Eric Watson, there definitely is a mood among the lawmakers, Republicans and Democrats, to try to essentially not let mob rule, drive them out of the Capitol and drive them away from doing their jobs. Now, obviously, Democrats and Republicans don't see eye to eye on, certifying the results for Joe Biden. People like Ted Cruz on the Republican side, were fighting it earlier today. As we discussed earlier in this program, I kind of feel like some of the temperature on that's going to be turned down, and they may actually try to use this as a moment of unity. Staring down the protesters in a sense by saying, you can't stop us from doing our work. That work was very divisive work. Republicans trying to say Biden wasn't the president, Democrats saying, of course, he will be on January 20th. So I'm not sure that exact conversation will continue with that level of sort of partisan vitriol, but we are expecting some action inside the Capitol later tonight. Timing and substance of that all to be determined.
And just to keep going on what is an extraordinary news day, now Google has announced it's taking down from YouTube that Trump video as well. So it's not just Facebook anymore, Craig.
Yeah, and I know there is sort of a growing mood, even among many Republicans, that Donald Trump needs to answer for this, for what happened today. In that, obviously he himself did not storm the Capitol, but you might say gave aid and comfort to the people who did. And I've seen people like Karl Rove, the strategist for George W. Bush, Mick Mulvaney, one of former President Trump's former chief of staff, a former communications director for him, all saying this is wrong. This needs to stop. The president needs to step up. He needs to tell these people to stop it. And obviously Trump, did not do that. So I actually think some of the fissures that Donald Trump has had with the Republican Party through the 4 years of his presidency, boy, he doesn't have a lot of friends right now. Right. I mean, to put it simply.
Craig, thank you so much. That's our Washington bureau chief, Craig Gordon. We're going to be continuing coverage on Bloomberg Asia. This is Bloomberg.
se logra una sonrisa de parte de cada persona que utiliza el dispositivo, ya que se pone en situación, entre comillas, de una persona discapacitada. Y ven que lo sorteamos de una forma agradable, porque el simple hecho de sentarse en un dispositivo ya es agradable.
Nace MAT como una solución de movilidad a personas con discapacidad, nace Mandados como una opción de generación de ingresos y nace MAT Tools como generación de ingresos y educación a las demás personas que no están en silla.
If they're not, then it is fines, another fines, repeated fines, behavioral commitments, but there is the option eventually to ask for a divestiture, splitting up a company as the last resort.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Very good morning. I'm Hattie Stroud-Watts in Sydney. We are counting down to Asia's major market opens.
I'm Sherian in New York. Welcome to Daybreak Asia. Our top stories this hour. Chaos at the heart of American democracy. Protesters stormed the Capitol. Shots are fired with at least one person wounded. President Trump and Joe Biden called for calm. A curfew is now in force in Washington. U.S. divisions are set to deepen as the Democrats win Senate races in Georgia. Joe Biden's party will have control of the chamber for the first time in 6 years. Asian stocks look set to follow Wall Street higher despite the Capitol chaos. The Georgia results fueling bets of more stimulus to support the U.S. recovery. And two of China's top tech stocks face a potential order prohibiting U.S. investment. Alibaba and Tencent could be added to a Wall Street blacklist. But of course, all eyes today were focused on those stunning pictures out of Capitol Hill with Trump supporters storming the halls of Congress. We had seen them rushing past police barriers at the Capitol. Right now, though, the U.S. Capitol has been declared secure after those violent protests. Debate on Joe Biden's victory in the Electoral College had been suspended. We don't yet know when Congress will resume deliberating, but we have heard from lawmakers that they want to get this through. Already tension was pretty high as we had seen President Trump asking his supporters to stop the steal and make a stand for his presidency. Those are pictures of Capitol Hill, Washington, D.C. under curfew at the moment. Take a look at U.S. futures right now, because when it came to the regular session, we really saw little reaction in the markets. And now S&P futures gaining ground. Of course, reflation trade back. Democrats moving closer to Senate control. They have actually Senate control now with those two Georgia runoff elections now settled for Democratic victories. We are seeing the NASDAQ futures also gaining ground, although we had seen the NASDAQ underperform as that rotation continued into small cap cyclical sectors. The 10-year yield getting past that 1% for the first time since March. WTI under a little bit of pressure, but still above that $50 handle. Let's turn to Sophie Kamarudin for a check of markets across Asia. Soph.
Sherry, this Thursday, we have a risk-on tilt in Asian markets. Sydney stocks opening higher, set to reclaim some of the 1% drop that we saw on Wednesday. And we are seeing Aussie bonds under pressure. The 10-year yield trading at June levels above 1% as we saw the moves on treasuries overnight. And let's take a look what's going on in New Zealand. The Kiwi stocks adding more than 1%, climbing to a fresh record high. And Nikkei futures gaining ground in Chicago. This as we wait on Japan to declare a state of emergency for Tokyo. This after national cases topped 5,000 on Wednesday. And when it comes to the oil patch, of course, keeping a close eye on what energy stocks will be doing in the region this Thursday. We have Beach Energy gaining ground almost 2% higher in Sydney. We have BOV of A saying that the oil markets are at the early stage of a rebalancing. Now let's flip the page to see what else is going on across assets. After many attempts, we're seeing that Aussie yen cross top 80, trading at December 2018 levels. This as the Aussie dollar is above 78, trading at March 2018 high. So this may prompt the RBA to jawbone the currency lower, and the yen strength that we've seen of late, that is garnering attention as well, with that 103 level, a key level when it comes to maintaining profitability for non-manufacturers in Japan. And over in the gold space, we do have bullion holding steady above 1920 this morning. This after it halted a 7-day gain yesterday. We have this emphasis on inflation trades versus what's going on in D.C. with the protests at the Capitol there, Heidi.
All right, so while President Trump has told protesters who stormed the U.S. Capitol to go home, hours after they marched on the center of American democracy at his urging.
I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side. But you have to go home now. We have to have peace.
At this hour, our democracy is under an unprecedented assault, unlike anything we've seen in modern times. An assault on the citadel of liberty.
And of course, we continue to hear the rhetoric from President Trump, even as he called on protesters to go home and to restore peace, that the election was rigged, that he understood their anger because he also continues to think that the election was stolen. We're just getting this tweet from President Trump now in the last couple of minutes saying there are things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. But again, reiterating, go home with love and in peace, but remember this day forever. And it's worth pointing out that that video where he called on protesters and rioters to go home, but continued to say that the election had been stolen from him, have been removed from both YouTube and Facebook, with Facebook saying that keeping it up seemed to exacerbate the risk of inciting more violence instead of diminishing that risk. Let's get the latest from our congressional government reporter, Laura Davidson, who's with us in Washington. So we continue to see the same narrative, the sort of go home peacefully, but I understand why you're here line from President Trump. But first up, just tell us what it's like in the Capitol at the moment. We're hearing that there's a level of security that's been restored.
Yeah, so the building is now secure. The curfew for D.C. Kicks in, just a couple minutes ago. There's still some protesters milling about. Police are clearing them, and the mayor of Washington has said that the people will be subject to arrest if they don't clear the streets. So that situation has improved. The House has said that they will come back tonight and continue deliberating on the electors. The Senate has not yet decided. They're all meeting in a secure room in the Capitol. Notably, some of the senators who were very vocal about wanting to voice objections, Senator Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, and others, are meeting in a separate room discussing likely what their path forward is. There's been some push from Republicans to not go forward with those plans. There's been a show of unity and in a show that yes, Joe Biden did win this election, to not raise the objections that they were planning to do earlier today.
Where do we go from here? How long will this process take? And will we see these objections withdrawn?
That is an excellent question. It depends if they're able to come back tonight. There could be still several hours of debate, depending how many objections are raised. For each state where there's objections raised, it can be up to 2 hours of debate. So originally there were plans to challenge 6 different states. That would be 2 hours times 6, 12 hours of debate. Unclear that if that will be the plan going forward. There's a lot of pressure on these senators, their colleagues, other Republicans saying, look, this will be more divisive. This will cause more unrest. Please do not do this.
Our reporter Laura Davidson there in Washington. We want to bring in now our Balance of Power anchor, David Weston. David, I asked Laura just now, what is next? Where do we go from here? I want to ask you, how did the United States of America get here? Peaceful transfer of power was supposed to be a key of any democracy.
Yeah, even sacred, Sherry. It's a terrific question. I think we're all asking ourselves that. At the same time, if you look back over it, I mean, it's shocking for any American, perhaps anyone anywhere, to see those vandals, those rioters breaking in, not just to the Capitol building, but actually to the Senate chamber, to the House chamber, which are very special places in the U.S. system of government. It's shocking. At the same time, it shouldn't really be very surprising. President Trump, particularly, has been leading a group of people saying that we really don't believe in these elections for months now. He's been saying we're not sure it's going to be fair. We think they may try to steal it. And even today at noon, he got up on a stage there just outside the White House on the Mall and said that it will not be legitimate for Joe Biden to be president of the United States because it has been stolen. And even as you saw in the video he posted saying you should go home, he said, I understand. It was a travesty what happened here. So to some extent, it's been building up. And President Trump himself sort of called on demonstrators to come to Washington to demonstrate on today because the Electoral College votes were being counted. So it's shocking, but maybe not surprising.
And David, we are just hearing from James Clyburn, the House Majority Whip, saying that the certification process for the Electoral College votes will continue tonight. David, I'm wondering, we compare this to the demonstrations we saw back in June and the sort of market reaction we saw then as well. How is this different in the sense that this is really, striking at the heart of the civil divisions within American society?
Well, obviously, we have a very divided society. If we had any doubt about that, it's certainly been driven home here. You're right, we had the demonstrations in the aftermath of some of the police killings, and there was a lot of damage done, and there was rioting done, and there was hooliganism, without a doubt. But it was not a group of people, some of whom were armed. We already have the D.C. police chief saying they've seized so far 5 weapons. Armed people coming to the Capitol of the United States and attacking the Capitol building itself. So in that sense, it's very, very different. And we have to bear in mind, President Trump was the one who condemned all of those demonstrations back in the summer and condemned the violence and said we may have to pull in the military to deal with it. So it's the shoe is very much on the other foot now, and it can't be a very comfortable place for a lot of Republicans right now.
Our Balance of Power anchor David Weston there. And right now we're being told by D.C. police that the woman who was shot during the Capitol protests has died. Let's take a closer look at where this is going. We're joined now by Hoover Institution Fellow and Director of Domestic Policy Studies, Lanhee Chen. And Lanhee, we're talking with both Laura and David about these stunning developments out of Capitol Hill. People just storming into the halls of Congress. Just give us your reaction of the magnitude of what has happened today.
Well, Sherry, it's the first time that the U.S. Capitol has been assaulted in this way since the War of 1812, to give you some historical context. It's a remarkable thing to see. I've been in and around those hallways, around the Senate chamber there in the U.S. Capitol building. It is a very well fortified area. It is an area that usually requires a lot of checkpoints to get to, security screenings. The U.S. Capitol Police is present there. To see that area breached, to see protesters occupying the seat of the Senate president, the presiding officer of the U.S. Senate. I mean, it's just shocking to see these things, and yet somewhat predictable as well in terms of how divisive our politics have become and how charged some people have become in terms of their reaction and response to elements of our political story here in the U.S. So it is both sad as well as disconcerting to see, and hopefully this whole situation can be wrapped up shortly by law enforcement.
But Lanhee, even as we hear the president asking his supporters to go home, that he's calling for peace, this is what he asked for. This is what he called for, right? For his supporters, with all his allegations that the election was stolen, that the election was rigged, that he was hard done by, that his supporters are hard done by, that this was the level of protest that he was looking for. So, as we report that one woman has died in these protests, how much of this responsibility is really with the president?
Well, the president animated a lot of the feelings of unrest. Certainly, look, there are a lot of people who are disappointed with the electoral outcome. Any election in America, there's going to be disappointment. And that's something we have to understand about the American system of democracy, is that there are two sides, and one side is going to be pleased, the other is not going to be. The question is what happens next. And it's the responsibility of leadership to say the election is over, the results have decided, the people have spoken. I wish they had spoken differently, but they didn't. And that is not a message the president has delivered yet. He has delivered a lot of messages. But the one message he needs to deliver clearly, and I'm not necessarily expecting him to do this, but it's a message that I think our society here in America would be better off for, is if he were able to say, look, the election is over, let's set differences aside, and let's try and come together to at least address some of the problems we face as a society. That's just not something the president has said.
One of the issues that has led up to this moment in history is that we have seen various Republican politicians really condone the president's behavior and his actions and his words. So how does the GOP really get back together after this?
Well, the first thing it has to do, I think, is to abandon any notion that there should be further challenges to the election. I think people have made their views clear. We've done a lot of discussion and debate over this. I think that's the first thing. And the next thing is to become a governing party again, to set out a vision for what it means to be Republican, what it means to make policy as a Republican. That's not about just supporting what Donald Trump wants. I think it's important for the party to set aside those notions of being tied to one person and instead be able to articulate a governing vision. Until it does that, it's going to be remarkably difficult to move past some of this. But hopefully some of that can begin after Joe Biden takes office in 2 weeks.
Are you worried that we're going to be here again in 4 years' time, or even in a few weeks' time? Do you think the power and the influence of President Trump will continue in the party?
I think the president's going to continue to have some influence after he leaves office. The question is how much and with how many people. I sure hope, Sherry, that we don't end up here again. This is a really disgusting place for American democracy to be, that you have some hooligans that have decided to make a mockery of some of the most precious landmarks in Washington, D.C., and frankly cause violence that has now led to someone's death. That is sad and unfortunate. So I hope we don't end up here again in a matter of weeks or frankly anytime soon.
Well said. Hoover Institution Fellow and Director of Domestic Policy Studies, Lan-Hee Chen there. Still ahead, we'll discuss the dynamics of China's vaccine rollout with Rand Corporation senior policy researcher Jennifer Bowie. But up next, the market perspective on the Democrat Senate win and the protest on Capitol Hill. Thornburg CEO Jason Brady joins us. This is Bloomberg.
We explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
I'm David Weston. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week.
You are looking at live shots there of what has been a remarkable few hours in Washington, D.C., the U.S. Capitol now being declared as secure by officials in Washington following what was a day of incredible unrest and violence brought on largely by Trump supporters who stormed Capitol Hill. We have heard from the president most recently in a tweet continuing to criticise what he calls a sacred landslide election that was unceremoniously and viciously stripped away, even as he calls on his supporters to go home and to restore peace. Of course, we've also heard from DC police that amidst that violence, one woman has died. Let's take a look at the market reaction now. What do investors make of the scenes that we've been seeing all morning here in Washington? I want to get reaction now from Bloomberg Investment Management CEO Jason Brady, who joins us now from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Jason, great to have you with us. So as we continue to watch these scenes, you know, most of us horrified by what we're seeing. At the same time, we're also seeing incremental progress being made when it comes to the political side of things. The Georgia runoffs, both of those runoffs now being declared victory for the Democrats, have taken the Senate 50-50. What does that mean to you in terms of policy making going forward?
Sure. So first of all, I think I, like many folks, are unequivocally condemning the violence that we've seen. And I think one key element to this, as far as the market reaction, is the Georgia runoff really showed that some of the more extreme statements that Republicans, or certainly the president, made, especially with regard to the Georgia Secretary of State, really had an effect on the election, the runoff elections in Georgia, and to me point the way to a much more moderate conversation going forward. I know that's hard to see right now, but the reality is some extreme statements may have pushed that election away from the Republicans. And so what you're seeing today is many elected officials, also on the Republican side, making statements, also condemning this violence and talking about really coming together. Mitch McConnell clearly won, Vice President Pence both came out with statements that were relatively conciliatory. So looking forward now, we have a very narrow margin in the Senate for a Biden agenda. And what the markets are doing is saying, hey, look, we might get more stimulus, we might get higher rates, and how do we react to that? And that's actually what we're seeing in the marketplace today.
It is really interesting, isn't it? You see these really tragic and awful events playing out, you know, live on television, on the streets of the U.S. Capitol, the very kind of question and institution of U.S. democracy coming under threat. At the same time, the markets seem pretty sanguine, right? Are they pricing in kind of a Goldilocks scenario where, yes, you'll get stimulus? No, probably the Democrats won't have enough majority in the Senate to be able to push through some of the more, I guess, market-averse policies?
I think that's exactly what we're seeing. So you're going to see stimulus, which I think is a bit more of a bipartisan subject. The question is really when and how much, not if. And tax, I think the tax code is going to be too big to tackle with a 50-50 plus one margin in the Senate. So really the more difficult things to pass, the real changes in policy are much less likely today, even with the Georgia runoff elections. Again, I'm most encouraged by the fact that I think you're seeing some Republicans and generally folks within government really be aghast at what's happened today, but also recognize that some extreme conversation around the Georgia elections really pushed voters away. And I am optimistic that there's going to be a bit more, maybe a lot more moderation going forward.
And Jason, we have the latest reaction coming from the Bank of America CEO, Brian Moynihan, also calling the events at Capitol Hill appalling, must move forward together peacefully, respectfully. Of course, we have heard from other Wall Street firm CEOs as well, talking about the violence that we saw today. But of course, Jason, going back to the markets, we have seen this win, the Democratic takeover of the Senate majority, really leading to that yield curve steepening, financials gaining ground.
Right. So Brian Moynihan's firm gained quite a lot of market cap today. For better or worse, it seems crazy to talk about it. But as you think about market reactions, what you can look at is a real rotation. So the steepening of the yield curve, the sell-off in treasuries, rising yields is really being a headwind, a significant headwind for some of the market leadership from 2020, which is to say high growth stocks, and a tailwind for the real laggards, which are some of the cyclical names to include financials. So as amazing it is, it always drives me crazy as a PM that, the change in the calendar actually matters. It seems like, one day is really the same as the next. What we've seen is that change in calendar also start to indicate a change in market leadership towards a bit of a cyclical recovery, and that's evident in financials, among other places.
This GTV chart on the Bloomberg just showing how rates have rallied recently. Of course, the 10-year yield moving past that 1%. When does this become an issue? How far above 1%? And we could see some overall repricing of risk, especially now that we have this Democratic sweep in Georgia?
I think it's already an issue. I mean, I think you're already seeing that rotation, and today it was a fairly significant one. So as I talk to clients, look, there are some folks who are overextended on the growth side. There's some folks without some balance, and you really need to have within your equity portfolio balance, not just with regard to cyclicals versus growth, as an example, but also internationally relative to the U.S., effectively a broader global exposure, which hasn't been what has worked in 2020, but actually I think will be effective going forward. So I think we're there now. What will be very interesting is the Federal Reserve reaction in the context of, do they increase purchases of treasuries or lock down the yield curve, even in the face of what looks like an okay recovery? One more thing. Oh, by the way, we're getting important employment figures Friday.
No, Jason, I was just going to pick up on, what the Fed does next, right? Every guest we've spoken to has said, oh, no, taper tantrum is not something we need to worry about this year, maybe not even next year. Rafael Bostic, though, from Atlanta, saying that they could taper this year. Is this a risk? And when you take a look at the liquidity-driven rally side of things, euphoria, does that really mean we need to see some of those earnings results come in phenomenally well to justify the pricing?
Yeah, look, I mean, phenomenally well, maybe certainly at least as well as expectations, if not better. And remember, there are going to be bumps on the road. When you listen to Rafael Bostic as an example, and he speaks reasonably, of course, all Federal Reserve officials are reasonable, cast your mind back to the taper tantrum. That wasn't the first time that Bernanke had talked about potentially removing accommodation. It just happened in that moment to be a vulnerable market moment, and things went haywire. I would say that today valuations in a lot of assets, particularly ones that have been really helped by Fed liquidity, could be challenged in the context, ironically, of a continued cyclical rally. So just remember, this rotation can have a negative side, not just in the context of being a headwind for growth, but also being a headwind for a lot of fixed income investors.
Jason Brady, great to have your thoughts. Thank you so much. Thornburg Investment Management President and CEO, with his market views of everything that's happening today. Let's cross back to Balance of Power anchor David Weston. And David, we've now digested sort of the magnitude of the events that transpired on Capitol Hill. Let's talk a little bit about policy, because, of course, adding to the frustrations of Trump supporters was the fact that the Democrats will take control of the U.S. Senate. But it's a thin majority. It's, in fact, a one-vote majority. What does this mean for Biden's agenda?
Yeah, it's such an important point, Sherry. In the middle of all of the rioting down on Capitol Hill, there was this little development that both of the Senate seats that were up for runoff elections in the state of Georgia went for Democrats, which gives us 50-50 in the Senate, which means that Kamala Harris, in case of a tie, as the vice president, will be able to break that tie. As a practical matter, it means, very importantly, that Chuck Schumer, the senator from New York, will be the majority leader rather than Mitch McConnell. That means they get to appoint committee chairs. It means they get to decide what goes to the floor. It will make it much easier for President-elect Biden to get his nominees through for the cabinet and other appointed positions. At the same time, it will not necessarily make it easier to have sweeping social legislation, a lot of taxation bills, a lot of spending bills, because as a practical matter, usually you need 60 votes, not 51 votes. But even on the budget reconciliation that you know about, Sherry, that you can get 51 votes, you've got a Joe Manchin, for example, a very moderate Democrat in West Virginia, who's not going to go for a lot of big sweeping social programs.
Hence, I think, David, why we're kind of seeing that sanguine reaction on the markets, right? Hoping for that Goldilocks scenario with the policy implications of the Senate result. I'm wondering, with everything that we've seen over the last few hours, with some of the rhetoric coming from Trump, and as Sherry mentioned, we've seen over the past few days and weeks some top, leading GOP members really condoning the behavior and the action of the president. Are we likely to get reconciliation on a party level and, I suppose, on a partisan level going forward?
Well, from your lips to God's ears, I mean, everybody would love that. It's been a long time since we've seen that as a practical matter. I think there's going to have to be, and it's early to really speculate what happens, there's going to have to be a real soul-searching, certainly in the Republican Party, maybe the Democrats as well, but in the aftermath of this, to really ask themselves about what is important, what are their core values. And I suspect that there'll be sort of a fighting back and forth for leadership on the Republican side, particularly because, as I say, it appears now Mitch McConnell is no longer to be the majority leader, which really opens up a slot. So it'll be interesting to see that Republicans are going to have to sort themselves out, I think, a bit first before they decide whether they can work with Democrats or not. But bear in mind, President-elect Biden is known for his ability to work across the aisle, as he did for many, many years when he was in the Senate himself.
And David, we're getting the latest statement from Speaker Pelosi right now saying that the House will proceed tonight once Capitol is cleared in consultation with Leader Hoyer and Whip Clyburn. After calls to the Pentagon, the Justice Department, and the Vice President, they've all decided to proceed tonight. Of course, that's coming at a time when the presidential certification was interrupted, given the Trump supporters stormed Capitol Hill. Returning to David on this issue with Joe Biden taking office in about 14 days, what do you make of regulatory changes, especially given that after all of this, while all of this violence was happening, we saw Google, Facebook really pulling down that video from President Trump where he told supporters to go home, but he also said that he won with a landslide victory.
Yeah, and certainly sympathized with the rioters, basically. Didn't call them rioters, of course, but sympathized with them, understood how they felt, and he loved them, he said, actually, in that first video release. It's interesting, those actions by Google and by YouTube to take down the videos didn't happen in a vacuum. There were several prominent figures in Silicon Valley that well before that, a few hours before, were calling on social media to really be much more diligent. This is an issue, as you know, Sherry, well, it has been really around Washington for some time, on both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans. Syria certainly is front and center now, and one would expect that maybe something may get done from a regulatory point of view from that aspect.
Balance of Power anchor David Weston there with us again. Let's get you to Karina Mitchell with the First Word headlines this hour.
Okay, Heidi, thank you. While the Capitol tries to recover from the chaos, there is other news to tell you about. China's two most famous tech stocks are in the spotlight, with U.S. officials said to be considering an order prohibiting Americans from investing in them. Alibaba and Tencent are the latest mainland companies to face action from the Trump administration, as the Defense and State Departments discuss expanding action against companies deemed to be linked to the Chinese military. In other news, China says the U.S. has been flip-flopping on policy for years, calling for respect for market principles amid the uncertainty over mainland companies trading in New York. The Foreign Ministry says the Trump administration has been oppressing overseas firms, warning the policy will hurt the U.S. more than China. Beijing says action against Chinese companies will undermine America in global markets. And the UK government is warning the latest virus lockdown will last for several months, as reported infections hit their highest level since April. Prime Minister Boris Johnson told Parliament that pandemic restrictions will be lifted only gradually as the situation changes. The lockdown is expected to slash the UK's economic growth and send the country into a double-dip recession. And rising virus numbers in Japan are expected to trigger a state of emergency in Tokyo. Local media say Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga will impose new measures, which will last at least 1 month. The move empowers local authorities to keep people at home and order businesses to close or limit their operations. Bloomberg Economics sees the emergency cutting 0.7% off national GDP. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Karina Mitchell. This is Bloomberg. Heidi.
Well, one of China's leading coronavirus experts has defended the country's delay in raising a global alarm in the early days of the outbreak and admitted shortcomings in the way. Beijing has cooperated with the World Health Organization. Dr. Liang Wannian was the senior official at the National Health Commission of China and actually oversaw Beijing's virus response until September. He spoke exclusively to Bloomberg.
I think this suggestion is normal and reasonable. First, it won't hamper our effort in tracing the virus origins. Second, it provides a new idea and path for scientists to trace the virus. But eventually, scientists will answer the question of where the virus came from.
到底是从哪来的？那还是要科学家来回答。
The Huanan food market was in focus at the beginning of this outbreak as potentially the source for the outbreak in Wuhan. This was the market where they sold wild animals. What is your view of the role that that market played in the outbreak that we saw in Wuhan?
就是说，华南海鲜市场是它的源头。我们现在不能得出这个结论。
We are not able to conclude that the virus originated in the Huanan seafood market. We can only tell that the first reported case is likely related to it. Assuming that the patient was exposed to the virus at the market, we need to have further research to figure out where that virus came from, whether it's from animal or from cold chain goods or from a human.
其他的物品。通过一个冷链系统，或者是其他的方式，或者还是有人带进来。
I need to point out that Huanan seafood market is probably not the beginning of the chain.
这一点我想说明一下。
Looking back, are there things that could have been done better in terms of the cooperation between China, Chinese experts, and the WHO? More effective cooperation?
我们确实也还有很多的一些短板和不足。
We indeed have a few shortcomings. Very few of our public health experts and clinical physicians can introduce our practice and communicate the information in a way that can be understood by their global peers. And few of them are familiar with international guidelines. We do need to strengthen these types of capabilities of our talents.
这一块的人才和能力的培养是需要进一步加强的。
You said yourself that you went on the ground in Wuhan on December the 31st and you were acting as though this was a transmissible disease. The World Health Organization puts out a statement on January 5th saying there is no evidence of human transmission, and they say that's based on Chinese data. What happened?
说在1月，你刚才说的是1月。
What we provided the World Health Organization in early January is that the evidence shows that the possibility of human-to-human transmission can't be ruled out. That's to say, we didn't find clear evidence of human-to-human transmission. That was the expression, but we didn't say it's not transmissible through humans.
早期的时候，700多名的密切接触者，没有一个发病的。
Among the 700 in close contact in early January, many with exposure to Huanan market, none fell sick in the 14-day quarantine. Neither did the 400 medical staff in contact with COVID patients. So there wasn't sufficient evidence at the time to determine human-to-human transmission.
That was Dr. Liang Wangnian from Tsinghua University Vanke School of Public Health, speaking exclusively to our Markets Co-anchor Tom McKenzie there. Well, the biggest global vaccination campaign in history is underway, with about 16 million shots administered so far, and China has given more than a quarter of those. To discuss China's vaccine rollout and its handling of the pandemic, we're joined by RAND Corporation senior policy researcher Jennifer Bowie. So, Jennifer, going off that really interesting interview, some of the points made there, is it fair for Western nations, the likes of Australia, for example, to be heavily critical of the way that China has handled the virus outbreak and actually continues to handle it, given that we have seen the World Health Organization investigators having a series of troubles of even being able to get access to the country for their investigations?
Yes, well, I agree in a way that it's unfortunate that we have seen this public health issue has been politicized. I think in the last year, this geopolitics and political size of the public health pandemic problems has made countries feel insecure, and that have in no way can help the scientists to find the source of the pandemic. In that, I feel it is unfortunate.
In what ways do and political system of China actually help it when it comes to things like rolling out a vaccination program nationally?
Yes. In terms of pharmaceutical industry in China, before COVID-19, it already have the capacity to produce 700 million vaccine for its domestic market, which is about a quarter of the world's overall vaccine production. So China does have a huge capacity in vaccine manufacturing. And in the last few years, we also seen that China has independently designed and produced a new vaccine for H7N9, as well as Ebola. So that means China does have this capacity developed in the last 10 years. The other requirement for the vaccine to get on the world market would be the regulation. So China in 2017 joined the ICH, which is a international pharmaceutical product standard committee, and they pledged to increase their standardized clinical data report, harmonize that to the global standards by 2022. So we see that China is on the way to become more international ready for its pharmaceutical sector. But so far, the vaccine, there only have 3 vaccines that's available for the international market, because most of the manufacturers are not equipped yet.
Not just that, but there seems to be a lot of mistrust over Chinese products, especially given that we saw China's exports in the beginning of the pandemic, subpar tests, not to mention PPE as well. How difficult is it for China right now to regain the trust of those developing economies that actually need China's vaccines?
So again, yes, I agree with the question. I think it's reasonable for country to question China's products' quality. It's partly because the Chinese vaccine are not very common on the world market. To be able to get to WHO pre-qualification, the vaccine will need to meet the requirement. First of all, they need to have the meets the good manufacturing practice, and that means quite a lot of investment from the companies. And secondly, they need to publish the clinical trial data in English in renowned journals, and that I think many of the manufacturers are working on that. And thirdly, they need to submit samples to WHO. So that's just to meet the minimum requirement for WHO pre-qualification, but it needs time and it needs technical know-how.
Rand Corporation Senior Policy Researcher and Tang Chair in China Policy Studies, Jennifer Bui. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll have plenty more to come on Daybreak Asia. This is Bloomberg.
Our generation's biggest problem.
Climate change is happening.
And the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered.
I certainly would expect that we'll have Goldman Sachs employees back in full by the end of the year. We will get through this, and I'm really hopeful that over the course of the next 6 months, we see a real improvement, but there's still work to be done.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
We're expecting congressional proceedings to restart anytime soon. We are hearing from Republican Representative Kathy McMorris Rodgers dropping her opposition to Joe Biden's win. This is according to the New York Times at a time when, of course, we are seeing more reaction to what happened today. Blackstone CEO Stephen Schwarzman also saying that this insurrection is an affront to democratic values. Let's bring back Balance of Power anchor David Weston and Hoover Institution Fellow and Director of Domestic Policy Studies, Lan Hee Chen. Thank you to you both for sticking around. David, let me start with you because, of course, we have heard repeatedly Joe Biden say that he will be the president for all Americans. But, of course, the country is so divided right now. What are we expecting in terms of political investigations, perhaps, now that we have the Democrats taking over control of the U.S. Senate?
Well, one of the things I think there'll be an investigation of is why there was not better defenses made for the Capitol, because there had been predictions of demonstrations leading up to this. And so a lot of people are going to be asking about the security that's really been put up around the Capitol and in the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C. I'm not sure that Joe Biden, the president-elect, has a big appetite for a lot of investigations right now. He says he wants to be the president for all the people. He wants to reach across the aisle. He's going to need to do that even with the 50-50 split in the Senate and a fairly narrow majority in the House of Representatives. So we'll see. Typically, you're right. When the majority shifts, then you have a lot of investigations. I'm a little skeptical, but Lonnie may know better than I.
Lani, I am curious to see whether you think investigations or, I suppose, accountability would be useful going forward, going into the next 4 years. What would be most useful to you in terms of a strategy to bring not just a Republican Party together, but the two parties together to be able to be productive, as well as unifying the divisions that we continue to see across the country?
Yeah, I think there will be an appetite for some investigative activity from some Democrats in Congress. I think David's absolutely right. The Biden team, the Biden administration, I don't think they're particularly interested. I think they'd rather move on and try and work on their agenda. But I do think some in the Congress, and now that Democrats will have control of both of the House and the Senate, I think some will want to look back to the Trump era and will want to investigate elements of that. In terms of what can heal the wounds at this point, I think a little bit of good old-fashioned bipartisan activity and the parties working together, demonstrating they can solve tough problems. And it's interesting, you know, because Democrats are going to have a narrow majority in the Senate as well as in the House, it is going to empower some of these more moderate voices. Senators like Joe Manchin of West Virginia on the Democratic side, like Susan Collins of Maine and Mitt Romney of Utah on the Republican side. There is going to be some incentive for those people to work together to actually get to solutions, infrastructure, healthcare, energy, you name it. So I'm actually optimistic. I try to be optimistic during these dark times that we are going to see actually folks working together, and that's going to help bring people together as well.
Lani, so what do you see in terms of priorities then? As you said, you're optimistic about what may happen in the next 4 years. So give us your list of priorities about things that can get done right now with this very thin majority by the Democrats in the Senate. And of course, they do have the House. And some of those issues that perhaps will be too difficult to tackle, especially given Joe Biden's political capital.
Yeah, I mean, let's start with a few areas of potential agreement. The first is infrastructure policy. I do think there's a sense that we've got to do something in the U.S. about our roads and bridges and airports and ship ports. That is something that the Trump administration had pledged to work on. They never quite got there. I do think that we'll see some bipartisan movement in that direction. I think that you're going to continue to see support for economic stimulus and support in the wake of and hopefully recovery from COVID-19. There was that discussion about larger stimulus payments. I think that's a foregone conclusion. We're going to see bigger stimulus payments now with Democrats in charge. And the last area I'll point to that markets care about greatly, particularly in the healthcare space, is prescription drug pricing. I think you're going to see a more aggressive role for the federal government in the pricing of prescription drugs in the United States. That's something the pharmaceutical industry has been generally opposed to, but I think it's coming, quite frankly, because there is some bipartisan consensus around that. I don't see action on more intractable questions like climate change, like single-payer health care, like more aggressive action on financial regulation. I think in those areas, the change is going to be more muted.
It's interesting, given that climate is one of President-elect Biden's top priorities. David, I'm curious, there will be the temptation, right, to go for kind of the low-hanging fruit, and the one issue that we know does unite the two sides and does play very well domestically with the public, which is getting tough on China. Do you think there's going to be much of a policy change in that perspective?
I think around the edges and in the tone and in the approach. At the same time, I don't think that a Biden administration wants to come in and be known as the one who went soft on China. And let's be frank, I think the attitude of much of the West, particularly Europe as well as the United States, has shifted over the last 4 years to not a hostility, but a sense that we really need to think really tough about how we deal with China. So I don't think they'll back away from that. But I will say the one thing that there could be bipartisan support of that would really rally people is the one thing that I think drove this election, and that is this pandemic. If there could be real bipartisan support for a massive public health vaccination program and getting around that to get us past this pandemic, that would do more than anything I can imagine to sort of heal some of the wounds.
Lanny, your thoughts on the pandemic and also China's these executive orders against China by President Trump and whether Joe Biden will keep them?
Well, first of all, David, as usual, is spot on. I do think if the Democrats and Republicans can come together and address COVID-19, whether it's vaccine distribution, continuing to build the public health infrastructure so that we're prepared if this pandemic goes on a little bit longer than we hope, those are things that will garner bipartisan support and, by the way, free up the economy to hopefully grow again. On the China question, I think what you're seeing in these last weeks of the Trump administration is a little bit of an effort to box in the Biden administration. To David's point, I don't think we're going to see too much change in policy in terms of being tougher edged on China. I do think the rhetoric is going to be more measured. I think you're going to see much more careful approach, particularly on economic policy and trade issues. But fundamentally, there is going to be an effort to try to get tougher on China. And I think some of that low-hanging fruit is around looking at companies that have ties or alleged ties to the Chinese military and making it harder for U.S. investors to access or for capital to get to those companies. I think that's something you're going to see continue in the next administration. And certainly that is going to be politically popular amongst Republicans and Democrats.
David, finally, as we see some semblance of calm being restored over the Capitol, I am wondering what the longer-term damage is likely to be in terms of the threat over the American democratic institution, right? Not just what we've seen, of course, in the last few hours, but the fact that we had the president calling it a rigged election over and over, and we had a number of, leading politicians in the GOP willing to stand up and defend him and willing to potentially thwart the process of certification of the Electoral College vote as well. Do you think there's been a lot of damage done, and does it weaken democracy in America?
Well, when we're in the middle of what is, I think, a crisis right now in Washington, D.C., it's hard to really project what it means. But I'll suggest to you sometimes you have to do, as you put it, damage before you can go forward. And the question I think that we'll have to be asking ourselves in the coming days and weeks and even months is, did we scare ourselves just a little bit? I mean, it's one thing to use very bold language and to stir up a lot of people in a rally, and it feels good. But in fact, those words can have consequences, real consequences, which are really frightening, I think, to a lot of Americans. So the question is there a way that actually there could be something of a silver lining here that could actually bring a lot of us up short and say, oh, wait a second, we may have gone just a bit too far?
Our Balance of Power anchor David Weston there with us, as well as Hoover Institution Fellow and Director of Domestic Policy Studies, Lan Hai-Chen. We appreciate both of your time, of course. All right, let's get a look at how Asian markets are waking up to all of this turbulence. So, what are you seeing?
Waking up with some positive sentiment this morning with stocks gaining ground. You have Aussie shares higher by more than 1%, Kiwi stocks reaching fresh record highs. And we're seeing that reflation theme come through in Sydney. You have tech under pressure while commodity players are gaining ground alongside financials. Declining loan referrals for Aussie banks, supportive alongside signals that we are seeing economic recovery down under. And we're seeing U.S. futures gain ground as well, while VIX futures are moving towards 24 this morning. So clipping the board after the overnight steepening that we saw in the Treasury curve. We're seeing Treasury futures hold steady, just up slightly this morning, while we are seeing the 10-year yields and the Antipodes gaining ground. The 10-year yield for New Zealand above 1% for the first time since July, and indicative of this risk-on tone that we're seeing across markets. Sherry, check out the Aussie yen cross extending gains above 80, a level that has not been breached since April 2019. Sherry.
Right, Soph, and be sure to tune in to Bloomberg Radio to hear more from the day's big newsmakers and get in-depth analysis from the Daybreak team, broadcasting live from our studio in Hong Kong. Listen via the app Radio Plus or BloombergRadio.com. Plenty more ahead. Stay with us.
Give you a sense of the real-time action. The 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
A quick check of the latest business flash headlines this hour. T-Mobile jumped in late trade after topping estimates for subscriber gains in the fourth quarter. The carrier added more than 820,000 users in the period, taking it above 2.2 million for 2020 as a whole. The results beat forecasts and come in ahead of the 700,000 new customers that T-Mobile had predicted back in November. Snow Lake Capital has written to the board of MGM, urging the company to sell 20% of its China operation to a local company as a strategic investor. Snow Lake owns 7.5% of MGM China and is targeting a leading mainland internet, travel or leisure company for that stake. A top executive at Louis Vuitton and one of Bernard Arnault's sons are set to take over the management of Tiffany after the biggest luxury deal ever. LVMH sealed the $16 billion deal last month after winning shareholder approval. Louis Vuitton's Anthony Ledru will lead the jeweler.
And we're headed to the Open in Japan and South Korea. Let's turn to Sophie again for what to watch. Soph.
Sherry, in Japan and South Korea, we are watching reflation-related plays that may ride that blue wave following the Democrats in the U.S. Claiming the Senate. So banks like Shimizu in Tokyo and infrastructure players like Hyundai Engineering in Seoul very much in focus. And on that energy theme, we're keeping a close eye on SK Group in South Korea. This after the conglomerate agreed to invest $1.5 billion in a U.S. fuel cell maker that is Plug Power in a bid to boost the use of hydrogen in Asia, as we're seeing a move towards clean energy in government policy, and as companies focus more on that space. So again, reflation, very much the name of the game this Thursday in Asia. Heidi.
Well, coming up on Daybreak Asia, the next hour, much more reaction to those events in Washington. We get the view from BGR Group Principal Lester Munson, who was actually the former staff director for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We, of course, also have the market opens coming up in Seoul and in Tokyo next, as markets continue to take the civil, political chaos that we've seen over the past few hours well in their stride. We have the US Capitol in lockdown, but with some semblance of calm and security being restored after those violent protests of Trump supporters flocking to the Capitol. And we know that, according to Washington, D.C. police, that one woman who was shot has since died. We have lots more to come, including the latest reaction and breaking news. This is Bloomberg.
新型にはなんと2万点以上前身でついてます。なので2万点あることにより、その情報が取れない、平面がないんですね。なので全てをスキャンすることができるので。どちらにせよ自分のサイズを1回最初から、適正なものを発見してそれを買って、家に届いてきたらぴったり非常にハッピーというのがやっぱりしかるべき姿かなと思ってます。
Aramco, as a company, is commissioned to enumerate the government for the sales of this crude based on trying to maximize their sales price. It's pure commercial rather than political choice.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Welcome to Daybreak Asia from Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York. I'm Sherry Ann.
And I'm Heidi Stroud-Watts in Sydney. Asia's major markets have just opened for trade. Our top stories this hour: chaos at the heart of American democracy. A woman is killed after protesters storm Congress. Police say Capitol Hill is now secure. Joe Biden's certification debate should resume soon. US divisions look set to deepen as the Democrats win Senate races in Georgia. The party will have control of the Congress for the first time in 6 years. And US futures are higher. Asian stocks look set to gain despite the Capitol chaos. Wall Street leaders are among those expressing shock at the scenes in Washington.
Some semblance of normalcy seems to have returned to the streets of D.C. This, of course, after a violent day of protests. We have seen President Trump telling his supporters to stop the steal. Republican Senator Richard Burr now coming out and saying that President Trump bears responsibility for today by promoting conspiracy theories. This, as we expect lawmakers to return to Capitol Hill to resume their electoral count tonight. In the meantime, markets and not much impact during the regular session here in the U.S. with stocks rallying. Let's see if this translates to the markets across Asia as well. Let's get straight to the market action with Sophie. Soph.
Yeah, Sherry, we are seeing that risk-on mood continue through into Asian stocks. You have the Nikkei 225 adding more than 1%, a ditto for the topics this morning, while the yen is steady above 103 after halting a 3-day gain. This after U.S. stocks rose on the Democrats clinching the U.S. Senate. Also today, we are waiting to see whether Prime Minister Suga will declare a second state of emergency for the Tokyo region. And earlier this morning, we got the latest set of data on wages for Japan falling for an 8th straight month through November. That may weigh on consumer spending, but again, this is backward-looking data. And when it comes to the themes that we're watching today, inflation very much in focus, and switching out the board in South Korea. We're going to see how the Kospi is opening up, gaining more than 1%, back above that 3,000 level after it tested that point yesterday. We saw that mood falter somewhat midweek as foreign investors sold amid lofty valuation concerns, but that has been offset today. We're seeing gains for Korean stocks. The Korean won, though, just slightly under pressure this morning. And we are seeing SK Group gain ground more than 5% this morning. This as it inked a deal to buy a U.S. fuel cell maker, that is Plug Power. And switching out the board to check in on the Antipodes this morning, we are seeing gains of over 1% for Kiwi and Australian stocks, and we are seeing 10-year yields for New Zealand joining their Australian counterparts above that 1% level for the first time since July for Kiwi 10-year yields. And we have higher Aussie yields perhaps looking to draw in fresh demand from Japanese buyers who are looking at those big yields right there. And taking a look at the board next, let's switch it out and check in on U.S. futures. We're seeing moves higher for S&P E-minis while the dollar is under pressure for a third straight day. Citi strategists warning that the Georgia runoff elections will increase the risk of a 20% drop for the greenback this year. And keeping close eye, of course, on treasuries after we saw the 10-year yield move above 1%. A lot of questions about what may happen next. Vishnu Varathan at Mizuho cautioning that a steeper U.S. yield curve going forward could still take a toll on EM currencies, Heidi.
All right, we do have some breaking news. So when it comes to the flurry of tweets that we've seen, the social media engagement from President Trump, of course, a video that he made calling for his supporters to go home, but at the same time, still saying that the election was rigged, that the sacred election landslide was stolen from them. We have seen Twitter now reacting, saying that the president's Twitter account will be locked for 12 hours, that they've removed 3 of President Trump's tweets. We had seen earlier that already limited engagement with some of these tweets because they had, again, made that claim, the unfounded claim of election fraud that is obviously disputed and had not allowed it to be retweeted or replied to. Now we're hearing that Twitter has suspended or locked down the handle at Real Donald Trump for the next 12 hours. We're also separately hearing from Facebook saying that they've removed over 600 militarized social movements, that they've been removing incitement, encouragement of the events in the Capitol, removing content that supports the storming of the US Capitol. And we did see Facebook as well as YouTube removing that video from President Trump as well earlier. Let's get the latest from our congressional government reporter, Laura Davidson, tracking these latest developments. So, Laura, we see very, very busy couple of hours for these social media giants and tech giants to try and get on top of clearly some of the fake news as well as content that Facebook sees as inciting more violence. What are you seeing now in the Capitol? We're hearing that the area has been secured and it's going to be a long night ahead for lawmakers when they return.
Yeah, like the tech companies, the Capitol Police are doing a lot of damage control right now. They said that the building is secured, but everyone is still under lockdown. We'll see what happens over the next hour. Senators have said that they will come back and start resuming their debate around 8 p.m., basically just an hour from now, East Coast time. If they're under lockdown, and it's not clear that they will be able to do that. But both the House and the Senate have said they're going to come back tonight. This is sort of a show of strength and a show of unity that, that the riots can't prevent them from doing their job and governing. The question is really, how long does this go? And do we continue to see the objections that were planned earlier in the day? There's a lot of pressure that's being put on 2 senators in particular, Josh Hawley of Missouri, as well by Senator Ted Cruz, to drop this. And said, Senator Mitt Romney, for example, has come forward and said, look, we need to drop these objections. We need to just give legitimacy to Biden and his presidency and not continue to create these divisions in a very awkward situation on the Senate floor.
Yeah, Twitter now saying that it will permanently ban President Trump's account on future violations, and Facebook also saying that they removed recent video of President Trump speaking on protests as well. And to your point of what's happening tonight, we already heard from the New York Times that Republican Representative Kathy McMorris Rodgers will be dropping her opposition to Biden's win. We also heard from Republican Senator Richard Burr saying that President Trump bears responsibility for today. What is this doing to the divisions already in place in the GOP, and where does the party go from here?
You know, that's an excellent question, and it really unsure right now. This will cause a reckoning within the Republican Party. I mean, if you're Mitch McConnell, today was an absolutely horrific day. You know, he is the leader of the Senate party, of the Republicans in the Senate. You know, he effectively lost his job when when Democrats won the Georgia races. He won't be the leader of the Senate anymore. He, you know, then was forcibly removed from his chamber today. This will cause a lot of questions for Republicans. If, you know, they had seen Trump as their leader going forward, will they continue to listen to him, or will they finally stand up to him and say, no, we're going to go a different direction?
Yeah, a fair bit of soul searching required within the party. Laura, talk to me more about this stunning result for the Democrats. It's very favourable results for the Democrats in Georgia. What does this mean in terms of policy-making ability in the Senate?
It means that Biden will have an opportunity to enact at least some of his agenda. Democrats will hold 50 seats in the Senate. You know, that's half, but they also have Vice President Kamala Harris, who will be able to cast these tie-breaking votes. With a very, very slim majority, they won't be able to do some of the big sweeping changes that had been talked about, you know, sort of big environmental changes or sweeping tax cuts. But they will be able to do some of those things. And but, you know, they'll need to work with Republicans. But there's some Republicans, moderates, who have been signaled willingness to work with Democrats, particularly after an event like we've had today. You'll see some coming together. Like after 9/11, there is a feeling that bipartisanship needs to be more prevalent going forward, rather these deeper divisions that, you know, really stoked the violence that we saw today.
Our reporter Laura Davidson with the latest there in Washington, D.C. Let's get a quick check. We are seeing a little bit of downside when it comes to trading in Twitter stock at the moment. Of course, we've just heard over the last couple of minutes or so, Twitter saying that they've locked down the account Real Donald Trump for the next 12 hours, pending the removal of 3 problematic tweets, saying that if those tweets are not removed, that lockdown will continue. Twitter also saying that it will potentially permanently ban the Trump account for future violations. This also coming as Facebook confirming that it's removed a number of, in fact, more than 600 posts when it comes to those content and posts inciting more violence, as well as removing President Trump's own video earlier on where he did call for peace and call for protesters to go home, but continued to allege and accuse others of conducting electoral fraud and having that election stolen from him. Facebook updating labels on posts that delegitimize the poll results. Let's get some analysis to what has been an extraordinary few hours from UBP Head of Equity Research for Asia, Kieran Calder. So, Kieran, we've been looking at the market reaction. In the US, it was fairly sanguine. In Asia, it's actually pretty positive. What do you make of this? Because typically it seems to be an understanding that what happens on the streets doesn't impact what happens in markets. And in fact, perhaps there's more positivity now that we have that Senate result coming as a result of Georgia.
I mean, obviously it's a little bit shocking, the things that we've seen, but I guess not surprising given that we're in the last 2 weeks before the inauguration. I guess anything can happen. A positive view might be it couldn't get much worse than it is now. But of course, as you pointed out, that's the street. The market is really looking past that. And so some certainty on the Senate going forward obviously gives a bit of new life into some of the Biden policies. So I think we're obviously going to see a reinvigoration of share prices around those things, particularly, let's say, green energy, things like this. You know, for us, I think you mentioned earlier the dollar, a weak dollar, we think is a major theme this year. Along with reopening and recovery. And obviously for EM equities, which is kind of our focus, particularly Asia, a weak dollar is good for EM equities, good for EM equity earnings, and also, of course, good for everything that's denominated in U.S. dollars.
And in fact, one of your overweight calls is to see continued positivity out of China. No, we know that the CSI 300 has been doing very well, but so far the height of that rally has really been concentrated in the large caps. Do you expect the rally to broaden out more in China?
Yeah, we do. We like China. We like domestic China. So we think that with I guess maybe a pause in China-U.S. tension, which certainly not an increase in tension, given with the Biden presidency, it'll enable the Chinese to focus a little bit inward on their own economy and the restructuring that they've been trying to do there. So we definitely think that China is going to be the leader in terms of economic growth globally, about 6% probably in the quarter just ended, and high single digits for 2021. We think that looks pretty good. And despite relatively elevated valuations, we think that earnings in domestic China have a good chance of growing into that. So we've rotated some of our U.S. equity holdings, which we still like the U.S., but we've rotated a little bit of that into EM and China in particular.
The majority of political analysts that I speak to are saying that perhaps we're not going to see a huge, swift or a fast shift when it comes to Biden policy towards China. And of course, we do have these President Trump executive orders, whether it's Chinese apps or the delisting of major companies. Are you a little bit more careful where you're putting your money in China, especially given that the pressure is not only coming from the U.S., but also domestically, we are seeing these regulatory changes?
Yeah, of course. And so on the point around, does everything change with Biden? Certainly, of course not. And in fact, some of the, measures that Trump put in place over the last few years were a long time coming and are very useful to a Biden administration as well. So we certainly wouldn't expect him to reverse some of the pressure. We would not expect him, though, to increase the pressure around tariffs, these sorts of things. So as you said, then we need to look at what is the Chinese government trying to do in terms of regulating some around fintech and microloans, these sorts of areas. So definitely we need to be cautious. On the other hand, it's very unlikely that China is aiming to kill the likes of Alibaba, for example. So we are opportunistic in terms of when share prices look attractive, and we're trying to stay away from those areas, let's say microfinance, which are going to see quite a bit of pressure, we think, at least in the next 2 to 3 quarters.
And Karen, before we let you go, we were talking about the U.S. and its impact on the emerging markets. We do have this new stimulus package. We could see much more coming with Democratic control of the Senate. Where in emerging markets and Asian assets would you see the biggest impact and opportunities coming from here?
Yeah, so I mean, we think finally fiscal is helping with monetary policy in terms of stimulus. So we think that's a long time coming, and of course the market's been expecting that. But to answer your question directly, I mean, this is obviously going to help with the along with reopening and recovery. It's going to add fuel to the tailwinds around global cyclicals, which are going to be the major play around reopening, better manufacturing activity, these sorts of things. So, from this perspective, we're looking at high quality value stocks, industrials, other cyclicals. If you had to pick a market or a region in Asia where that was, it would be North Asia. And also I would keep an eye on Japan, which is really a play on global cyclical recovery.
UBP Head of Asia Equity Research, Karen Calder, thank you so much for joining us. And we do have breaking news right now. Vice President Pence has returned to the Senate. He had remained at Capitol, this according to an aide of his. Of course, we had seen Vice President Pence being taken to a secure location. We're now hearing from an aide that he remained at Capitol, and his return to the Senate. We have heard from lawmakers that they will try to resume the process of the electoral count that was disrupted because of these violent protests and the storming of the halls of Congress by President Trump supporters. Of course, Vice President Pence had earlier also called for the violence and destruction of the Capitol to end, and he had, in a way, defied the president, saying that he has really no power to intervene when it comes to the election results. Right, let's turn to Karina Mitchell with the first world headlines. Karina.
Okay, Sherry, we saw that Twitter just took some bold action, but China's two most famous tech stocks also in the spotlight, with U.S. officials said to be considering an order prohibiting Americans from investing in them. Alibaba and Tencent are the latest mainland companies to face action from the Trump administration as the Defense and State Departments discuss expanding action against companies deemed to be linked to the Chinese military. Meanwhile, China says the U.S. has been flip-flopping on policy for years, calling for respect for market principles amid the uncertainty over mainland companies trading in New York. The Foreign Ministry says the Trump administration has been oppressing overseas firms, warning the policy will hurt the U.S. more than China. Beijing says action against Chinese companies will undermine America in global markets. And rising virus numbers in Japan are expected to trigger a state of emergency in Tokyo. Local media say Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga will impose new measures which will last at least a month. The move empowers local authorities to keep people at home and order businesses to close or limit their operations. Bloomberg Economics sees the emergency cutting 0.7% off national GDP. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Karina Mitchell. This is Bloomberg. Heidi.
Oh, coming up, we get more reaction to the events in Washington. We'll be getting the view from BGR Group Principal Lester Munson, who's a former staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And we will be speaking to Eurasia Group's Kevin Allison about the Trump administration's confrontation with China's tech sector and what could happen under a Biden administration. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Are you worried that people won't take the vaccine?
We remain concerned about vaccine hesitancy.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here?
It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
Twitter has locked Donald Trump's account for 12 hours, pending the removal of 3 tweets that violate user policies. It's also threatening to permanently ban Trump's account on future violations. Facebook and Google have also removed his video. Let's cross to Bloomberg senior tech reporter Sarah Fryer in San Francisco. Sarah, what does this all mean, especially for these social media companies, given the President Trump's presence in the social media arenas has been so big? What would a removal of his content mean?
Well, it really is a bit of an experiment that they're doing right now, because they have never gone this far with Trump before. And in the past, we've heard from employees and people working on policy there is that they're worried that if they did take severe action on Trump, that it would be fitting in with the conservative claims of censorship. Of course, Trump is also a user of these private platforms that have rules that need to be followed, and he's come close to the line many times and across the line many times. And now I think that now that they have seen there's a Democratic administration coming in, they are a little bit more confident in what they're doing with Trump, and also are getting a lot of pressure from their employees to do something. Everyone is looking at what's happening with the riots, their violence, it's scary. It's something that they can do something about, because they can try to prevent the incitement of this action on their platforms.
It's interesting, though, because if you were to be cynical, Sarah, you look at the power that social media and some of the, news content or questionable content has been responsible for in the past 4 years. There'd be a lot of criticism that, well, this is a little bit of, too little, too late, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they could have done this years ago, right? They could have done this during, the Muslim ban. They could have done it during. There are so many different instances where people have called on Twitter and on Facebook to limit Trump, and they haven't done it, in part because he was in power. And now that he's losing power, cynically, I think that's why it's a little easier for them to take the plunge.
Bloomberg's senior tech reporter Sarah Fryer there in San Francisco talking about these actions that we've seen from the likes of Twitter and Facebook, which of course they have resisted for some time now, but finally taking that action to lock President Trump's account for the next 12 hours. Meanwhile, we're hearing from other global business leaders coming out in droves to condemn the violence that we've seen in Washington, D.C. For more, let's bring in our Chief North Asia correspondent, Stephen Engel. Steve, what are you hearing? What are they saying?
Well, a lot of world leaders who are condemning it, obviously coming out, and also business leaders as well. Not a lot coming yet from the Asia-Pacific region. A lot of this happened in our overnight period, but Asia is now waking up to the scenes in Washington, D.C. We might be getting some statements coming forward, but we are not hearing from the likes of Vladimir Putin or Mr. Bolsonaro from Brazil, widely seen as being more favorable to Trump. But these are the comments we're getting so far from other world leaders. Boris Johnson, in a tweet, called the scenes in the U.S. Congress disgraceful. The U.S. stands for democracy around the world, and it's now vital that that there should be a peaceful and orderly transfer of power. Now, some of the more striking comments coming from the German foreign minister. He actually referred to the 1933 burning of the German parliament building as Nazism was taking hold. The enemies of democracy will be happy to see these incredible pictures from Washington, D.C., says Heiko Maas. Riotous words turn into violent acts on the steps of the Reichstag and now in the Capitol. The disdain for democratic institutions is devastating. Devastating comments from the German foreign minister there, as well as the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Shocking scenes in Washington, D.C. The outcome of this democratic election must be respected. Wall Street also coming out, and big business leaders. Bank of America's Brian Moynihan calling it appalling. Larry Fink at BlackRock called it an assault on our nation, our democracy, and the will of the American people. And Steve Schwarzman, a Trump ally, of Blackstone, of course. The insurrection that followed the president's remarks today is appalling and an affront to the democratic values we hold dear as Americans. I am shocked and horrified by this mob's attempt to undermine our Constitution. And again, he reiterated the outcome of the election is very clear and there must be a peaceful transition of power. Wall Street also coming out. JP Morgan's Jamie Dimon. Previously, of course, he sat on Trump's advisory council. I strongly condemn the violence in our nation's capital. This is not who we are as a people or a country. We are better than this. And among a long list, I will just add David Solomon, Goldman Sachs CEO, says, for years, our democracy has built a reservoir of goodwill around the world that brings important benefits for our citizens. Recently, we have squandered that goodwill at an alarming pace, and today's attack on the U.S. Capitol does further damage.
Steve, when it comes to China, a country that, of course, insists other countries shouldn't interfere in their internal affairs, I can't really imagine them commenting about what's happening in the U.S., but at the same time, we have U.S.-China tensions. So anything yet?
I wouldn't be surprised that there would be some sort of statement coming from the foreign ministry later today, but it's not going to be along the lines that I just read out. They are not going to be talking about the assault on democracy, especially what happened here in Hong Kong yesterday with a roundup of more than 50 or several dozen pro-democracy supporters here in Hong Kong. In fact, the liaison office here in Hong Kong said the step that Hong Kong police took yesterday is to put Hong Kong back on the right path or the right track. So I'm not expecting much from Beijing. We are yet to hear, though, from the Asian allies like Japan, like South Korea, here in Asia as Asia wakes up.
Our Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel there with the international reaction to all of the events here in the United States. Let's get more analysis from Lester Munson, his principal of the government relations firm BGR Group. Lester, great to have you with us. Of course, it was really a stunning day. Those pictures that we saw out of D.C., the chaos. And really, when it comes to whether it was the violence today or the objections to this electoral vote count, it's not a good look for Republicans. Where does the GOP go from here?
It's a terrible look for Republicans. I totally agree with you. It was horrifying to watch. As someone who worked there for several years, I couldn't help but be really very concerned about what was going on. Those places where we saw the rioters inside the Capitol are as close as we have to sacred ground in our country. That's where our laws are made. That's where we come together as a people and find compromise and enact our democracy, our representative democracy. That's where it happens. And for this insurrection to have happened in those very places is really horrifying at a deep level. I think Republicans are going to be reeling from this for a while. Those images are not going to go away. This will be the legacy of President Trump and will be a part of him going forward, I think, for the rest of his life. The party itself is going to have to wrestle with this openly. And I think you're going to see a lot of members. You're already seeing a lot of Republicans condemn this. That's good. They need to purge people from the party who supported anything remotely like this. I suspect that once President Biden takes power and Democrats start to roll out their agenda, the focus will change a little bit. It'll be a little easier for Republicans to get together and unify on something. But right now, there's going to be a reckoning over what happened today.
How can Joe Biden really heal the country? What should he do first?
Well, I think he needs to reach out to Republicans. He needs to show that he's the president of the entire country. He's been calm, cool, and collected during the campaign. He only, on rare occasions, rose to the kind of vitriol that President Trump was offering during the campaign. I think he needs to keep doing that. He needs to rise above, and he needs to be able to do that for as long as he can. Recognizing that his agenda is not necessarily a bipartisan one, there's going to be some issues where the two parties disagree. That's natural. That's okay. But I think as long as President Biden, once he takes office, as he stays above the fray and is a voice of calm and reason and reaches out to those Republicans who want to work with him, then he's going to have some very good reviews and his approval ratings will be pretty high.
You know, there's some people that point out, we talk about these deep-felt divisions in American society that we see at the moment playing out over the past few hours, the past few weeks, in fact, the past 4 years. But a lot of people would say America has always been divided, right? It just depends on the issue, depends on the time period that you're talking about. Is there a way to get back to a level of, I guess, constructive division where we can actually see progress and reconciliation as well as a differing of opinions?
Well, that's a great question, and it's really going to be up to the elected leaders that we have and see how they carry out their agendas, particularly for the next 6 months. You know, the first 6 months of any administration are probably the most important ones. This is the time when President Biden will get the most done that he will throughout his tenure as president. So he's going to have to, I would urge him, reach out to Republicans. Don't have an agenda that's exclusively Democratic. Try to be bipartisan when you can. look to collaborate with the other side, try not to have structures that eliminate the minority concerns. Both the Senate and the House are so closely divided. The Senate's literally going to be 50-50 in a couple of weeks. The House is only about 5 members away from being in control by the Republicans. So he's going to have to reach out to the other side. I think if he does that in an active way on issues that matter, that can do a lot to help the country. But we also need to see that from Republicans. Republicans are going to have to show that they can work with the new president, that they're willing to put their partisan concerns aside, that they want to find a calmer way forward.
And of course, one of the, I guess I would say low-hanging fruit, or one of the issues that we know that there's willingness in both camps to continue the sort of status quo, as well as something that plays out very well with the public, is this idea of continuing to get hard on China, right? Do you expect much of a pivot when it comes to the strategy with Beijing or with foreign policy overall?
That's a great question, and I know your viewers are very interested in it. I think the pressure on China is only going to grow in Washington. It may not be as immediate as what the Trump administration was talking about today, these new penalties on Chinese companies. But the long-term trend is for more and more pressure on China. It's a bipartisan issue. Both, particularly Republicans are concerned about it, but increasingly Democrats are also. And Republicans were held back a little bit by President Trump's willingness to do trade deals with Beijing. That's no longer going to stop them from promoting legislation that calls for broader and greater sanctions on China, on Chinese companies, on international companies that do business with Beijing. So I see that as something that's only going to increase the pressure on Beijing.
BGR Group's Lester Munson, thank you very much for joining us this evening with his insights on everything that's happening in Washington. And House Speaker Nancy Pelosi now saying that the electoral count will resume later, despite, of course, the storming of the Capitol building. Let's get the latest from our chief Washington correspondent, Kevin Cirilli. Kevin, so what's the schedule looking like right now? Because lawmakers seem determined to really resume the electoral vote count.
They're trusting the process, and in fact, the institutions of democracy still being the guiding force over the next couple of hours in order for that certification process that was set to begin now about 6.5 hours ago. Now will reconvene, we're told by sources on Capitol Hill, in the next 30 minutes or so at about 8 p.m. local time here in the nation's capital. A capital, mind you, that is under a lockdown as a curfew, rather, I misspoke, a curfew that the Mayor Bowser, has imposed now in its 90th minute as the city is really on edge. And there's a sense of palpable intensity as the Associated Press has reported, Sherry, that the Capitol campus has been, quote unquote, secured. We're also learning new reports within the last hour or so that the woman who was shot has unfortunately passed away. It comes as public comments from across the ideological spectrum, from Democrats to Republicans, condemning President Trump for his comments this afternoon and into this evening, and even going so far as to say that the video that he posted to his social media account on Twitter did not go far enough in order to discredit and disavow the mob that had rushed inside of the Capitol and destroyed property damage and historical items of significance.
And of course, we continue to see him make these allegations, these unfounded allegations of electoral fraud, which resulted in that video being removed from some of these platforms, right? Kevin, where to from here? It's going to be a long night for lawmakers as they return. Is it procedural from here that the certification will be done despite the disruption that we've seen?
Well, there's 2 points that I would make here quickly. First and foremost is that the New York Times is reporting that Congresswoman Cathy McMorris Rodgers, a Republican member of the minority in the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives, they're saying that she is going to withdraw some of her opposition that she was planning to file this afternoon with regards to objections to the certification process for the 2020 election. It's a marked moment, because it's the first Republican who is suggesting that they would like to take a more a quick approach in terms of the certification effort as a result of the calamity that unfolded inside of the Capitol. And the second point that I would make is that based upon sources that I've been speaking with all throughout the day, including members of Congress, there's this sense of bipartisanship feeling that has emerged that the best path forward right now for the institution as a whole is for them to convene, for them to do their job, and to show the American people that the institution is still working. And so that's what I think the public comments that we're reporting on the Bloomberg terminal from Speaker Pelosi, a Democrat, to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, a Republican, saying, don't go anywhere. Don't go anywhere because we got a job to do tonight. And that they're fully planning to get those lawmakers back to work to finish this certification process.
Kevin Cerulli, our Bloomberg chief Washington correspondent, after a very long day there. And you can also turn to your Bloomberg for more on the unrest in Washington, the political as well as the market reaction, in particular to the result of the Senate runoff race in Georgia. Go to TLive Go, that is, to get commentary and analysis from Bloomberg's expert editors. All right, well, we do have some breaking news when it comes to, or an alert crossing the Bloomberg, I should say, when it comes to Australia's trade numbers. November trade surplus coming in at just over 5 billion Aussie dollars. That is somewhat short of the 6.4 billion that had been expected. When it comes to exports to China, it breaks down to about $11.4 billion. So a little bit of a miss when it comes to the trade balance number. Imports seeing a rise of 10% from the month prior, exports rising 3% from a year earlier, leaving, of course, with that slightly slimmer than expected trade surplus of just over 5 billion Aussie dollars. All right, let's take a look at the markets. So if we continue to see this optimism as hopes of more stimulus in the US start to play out.
Yeah, so that's driving a reflation trade along with prospects for more economic recovery, not only in the U.S., but across the globe. So we're seeing the regional index in Asia rise more than 1% with gains across the board, as you can see right now. In Korea, it's Samsung that's the biggest boost for the Kospi, which is trying to test that 3,000 level once again. And resource stocks are leading gains over in Sydney, while tech is the glaring laggard on the ASX 200. And in Japan, the Nikkei 225 is set to halt a 4-day drop as we wait to hear from Prime Minister Suga later this evening on the emergency declaration for Tokyo. We are hearing from the economy minister of Japan saying the emergency proposal for Tokyo area that will run through February 7th, and they will ask eateries to close no later than 8 p.m. This as they continue to see the medical system under strain in the Tokyo area. Now let's flip out the board and check in on how bonds are faring in the Asia session this Thursday. We're seeing pressure across the board, but treasuries holding steady above 100 basis points this morning. And looking ahead, JP Morgan is saying that they see upside risk to their year-end target of 1.3% by the end of the year on benchmark treasuries, given the results from the Georgia runoff. And with yields pressured higher, flipping the board, we are seeing Asian financial stocks gaining ground today. Take a look at what's going on with financial players. Topics banks index more than 3% higher this morning as we see that rotation into value continuing. And flipping the board, we're seeing infrastructure names gain ground as well on the cyclical tilt. This we're seeing copper futures on the rise and WTI just holding above $50 a barrel. But I just want to point out one underperformer in the Asia session this morning, Sherry. That is SoftBank, Alibaba's biggest shareholder. SoftBank shares falling in Tokyo this morning. Flipping out the board to check in on that if we could. We're seeing that on reports that the U.S. may add Alibaba and Tencent to a U.S. stock ban. Sherry.
Yeah, actually, we'll discuss that. We could see a ramp up of U.S.-China tensions before Joe Biden enters the White House. As Sophie mentioned, the NYSE again proceeding with a plan to delist 3 Chinese telecom firms, and now U.S. officials debating whether to bar investment in Alibaba Group and Tencent. Let's discuss this with the director of Eurasia Group's geotechnology practice, Kevin Allison. Kevin, great to have you with us. Of course, this coming at a time when we're seeing political violence, really tensions across Washington, D.C. Some people saying that the easiest consensus between Republicans and Democrats to heal the country could be going hard against China. What will happen to President Trump's executive orders, whether it's on Chinese apps or all of these major telecom communications bans, stock bans, and so on?
Well, there's no question that during the course of the Trump administration, the U.S. has taken a new and much more aggressive approach to confronting China around some of these technology issues. But I would say one of the things that we try to emphasize is that the reasons for that, both national and economic security-wise, predate the Trump administration, and they will also outlast it. So we do think that Joe Biden and his administration will continue a tougher approach to China than you would have seen, for example, under the Obama administration, in which Biden served as vice president. So that will continue. But we do also see some important differences in the style, the substance, and the structure of U.S. policy oriented at China, particularly when it comes to these things you mentioned, like entity list actions against companies, attempts to try to ban apps, and other pretty aggressive actions to really push back on China's rise by some of the national security hawks within the Trump administration today.
Yeah, in a way, we're seeing more consensus towards the need of an industrial policy against China when it comes to this growing tech rivalry, right? So will we then continue to see these initiatives like the Clean Network Initiative targeting Huawei, some Chinese apps as well?
Well, I think that industrial policy is going to be an important part of the U.S. strategy on China going forward. It already is in some sense. The 2021 National Defense Bill, which was just passed by a veto override by Congress, includes setting up funding for encouraging domestic semiconductor manufacturing, for example. Now, it hasn't fully funded it, but assuming that Congress makes those appropriations, you'll have potentially tens of billions of dollars in grants or tax incentives coming in to support advanced semiconductor fabrication facilities here in the United States, where I'm based. I think that the industrial policy side of it is interesting because so much of what the Trump administration did, certainly during its first 3 years, was more in terms of going after Chinese companies. But there has been a growing sense, I think, on both sides of the aisle on Congress that needs to be balanced by measures to invest more domestically in shoring up U.S. innovative capacity. So the money is already starting potentially on its way in semiconductors. And we think, for example, in green technologies, that the Biden administration will be interested in using industrial policy to try to compete more with China, which, let's face it, they have a bigger lead on some green technologies like batteries, solar, and other things over these U.S. companies because China has had much more proactive policies in those areas.
And if nothing but a whole of government approach, right, that they do, you know, for all the criticism, they do that very well in China. Is that something that's required from the US? Because, yes, you've seen the Trump administration get very tough on China, but it's also been a very, you know, ad hoc, quite often chaotic approach when it comes to executive orders and entity lists and things that are not necessarily predictable. Is more predictability in the relationship something that's required going forward?
Well, that's when I said that we expect differences in style, structure, and substance from Biden. That's one of the style things that we think will be different. We think that there will be much more of an emphasis on process, whereas the policymaking by the Trump administration has tended to be more every agency for itself, sometimes agencies making determinations, sticking a company on the entity list without really clearing it through what we would call a traditional interagency process, where all the different parts of the government get together. So I think we'll see less haphazard, less chaotic, and maybe a little more orderly, a little more traditional. And in that sense, I think you'll see smoother policymaking. We think another big difference will be engagement with allies. So even as the U.S. was under Trump going really hard against China, it was also not exactly doing a lot to ingratiate itself with potential U.S. allies. In fact, it was targeting them, threatening tariffs and other things, stretching national security authorities to target European car makers, for example, and threaten them with tariffs. So we think that goes away. There's a lot more interest, certainly, on the part of the Biden administration in engagement across the Atlantic and with other types of allies. The question is whether the U.S. and Europe, or the U.S. and some other countries that have traditionally been more democracies, more aligned on some of these questions, can find common ground on things like digital privacy, industrial policy, and regulation of big internet platform companies.
Eurasia Group Geotechnology Director Kevin Allison there. It's going to be really pretty interesting few weeks coming up in the next 4 years to see what difference there is when it comes to that strategy towards China from Washington. Well, coming up next, Tokyo and surrounding areas are bracing for a state of emergency, which could be declared later today. We'll get the latest from Tokyo. And of course, we are continuing to watch any of the latest developments that are coming out From, of course, Washington, D.C., this as we have some semblance of security and calm being restored on the Capitol after a few hours of violent protest. Pro-Trump supporters storming the Capitol, resulting in the death of one woman